Members, if I could have everyone take their seats. Members, on behalf of Speaker Schexnayder, I'd like to welcome everyone to the House chamber today for the meeting of the Joint House and Senate Natural Resources Committees. I'd like to welcome our federal delegation and members of the public for joining us here this morning, whether in person or online. We have a little housekeeping to do. Today is February 10th, 2021. It's a joint meeting of the House Natural Resources and Environment Committee and the Senate Natural Resources Committee. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Representative Couzon?
Here.
Here. Representative Bourriat? Representative Butler? Representative Carrier? Representative Cormier? Here. Representative DeVilliers? Here. Representative Gaiman? Representative Kerner? Here. Representative Landry? Here. Representative Mincy? Here. Representative Orgeron? Here. Representative Reiser? Here. Representative Romero? Here. Representative Shammerhorn? Representative Wheat? Here. 10 members are present for the House. Senator Henskins? Here. Senator Facey? Here. Senator Alon? Here. Senator Bowie? Here. Senator Connick? Here. Senator Hewitt? Here. Senator Lambert? Here. Senator Ward. 7 members are present for the Senate.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Folks, remember to silence your cell phones. If you need to take a call, step out of the room. If you wish to provide testimony or you are scheduled to provide testimony, please submit a witness card. You'll be submitting them along the rails here, and they'll be forwarded up front. Green in support, red if opposed, and white if you wish to provide information only. Fill out the card in its entirety. In an effort to protect our members and our guests and staff, please sit in the House gallery or along the back rail near the back of the chamber. Space is limited, so please be mindful of others. Members of the public who wish to provide testimony are asked to use the standing microphone at the rear of the chamber. Elected officials, department representatives, and other guests who are planning to speak will be permitted to use the well on the House floor. Committee members are asked to push their personal privilege button at their desks if they're ready to ask a question. In accordance with our rules, I reserve the right to do a time limitation. We have a hard stop of 2 p.m. today. With any luck, we'll be finished before that. But to the extent that we are not pushing the time limits, we'll let all of our witnesses speak till they're done. I want to welcome a couple of new members to our House committee. We have a new and old member, Representative Brett Guyman, rejoining our committee. Representative Guyman, where are you? Welcome back. As I understand it, this time serving on this committee is a privilege rather than a punishment, but regardless, welcome back to the committee, welcome back to the legislature. And also new to the committee is Representative Shammerhorn. Shammerhorn may not be with us this morning, but we welcome him to the Natural Resources Committee. Speaker Schexnayder had a brief comment. We need to work together to make sure that the federal government understands our state's needs and the needs of this industry. We don't want handouts. We want to be able to allow our citizens to have a stable and confident work environment. We must be sure that we speak up and let Washington know that changes such as these that so greatly challenge our state's economy are harmful to our people. Moving Louisiana forward will take every one of us, and I challenge each of you today to think big and put forward ideas that will positively affect change and the course of our state's history. And as we get started, what we'll do, I'll make a brief comment, and then I'll call our first speaker. For those of you in the chamber You should have a list of our speakers today. If you don't, we can get one of those to you. Just raise your hand. Tyler, do our members and guests have the list of the speakers? It should be in your folder at your desk, and we're going to go roughly in that order unless there's a request to go out of order due to time limitations. As we've all experienced together in these last few months, the COVID-19 pandemic has burdened our lives, placing many families and businesses in hardship, especially our energy economy. The oil and gas industry has long been a cornerstone of Louisiana's economy, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions in revenue, and inducing other economic development achievements around our state. But during these current times, Louisiana has experienced record job losses, capital expenditure cuts, and these impacts will linger for the foreseeable future. Yet, if there's one thing we can learn from our history books, it's that the people of Louisiana are resilient and unafraid to do whatever it takes to overcome the challenges ahead. We saw this in Louisiana after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We're seeing it now as Southwest Louisiana recovers from Hurricanes Laura and Zeta, and we are seeing it throughout the state with COVID-19. The great state of Louisiana builds back better than anyone. As we continue to fight through the current adversity, the new federal administration has added to our issues. As many of you know, President Biden's first day in office came with many executive orders. They were targeted at boosting our economy, immigration reform, promoting equity and diversity, and COVID-19 safety. But of most concern to this committee and to our state are those orders targeting at limiting oil and gas activity as a means to reduce carbon emissions and its impact on our climate. At its cores, these executive orders come from a misunderstanding of our oil and gas industry. This industry has shown a commitment to more safe and responsible practices, investing billions in technologies that reduce harmful pollutants, and is committed to making these enhancements while producing enough energy to transition away from being dependent on foreign energy. Since the 2010 Deepwater Horizon incident, the offshore industry has made tremendous strides. According to the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, in 2018 and 19, the offshore industry experienced the lowest volume of oil spilled in at least a quarter of century. And in 2019, the industry had the second safest record among hazardous industries in America. Revenue from the Outer Continental Shelf production is fueling the most ambitious green infrastructure investment program in the world between the investments in our coastal restoration through the CPRA and our protection projects via the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, GOMESA. Today we have with us Chip Klein, who will speak on behalf of CPRA, and we also have Scott Angel, who is the former head administrator for BESI, to speak on those issues. To top it all off, the U.S. Gulf of Mexico deepwater production has some of the lowest carbon emissions both locally and internationally. As chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee and a representative for Lafayette, the hub of the oil and gas industry, I truly believe that having to choose between energy and the environment is a flawed narrative. Emissions reduction and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. These executive orders will greatly impede the environmental progress that the industry has and is continuing to make. We should seek public policy that fosters and incentivizes innovation rather than an all-or-nothing approach. Last year, we did just that in the state of Louisiana. Rep. DeVilliers, one of our members, filed legislation aimed at stimulating the economy by incentivizing businesses to take over orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells to produce what was left and have those same companies properly decommission the wells. This year, I'm carrying the same bill. This legislation incentivizes oil and gas activity and reduces orphan wells currently on the state's rolls. It's a prime example of how energy and the environment can be mutually beneficial. It is ideas and policies like this that will allow Louisiana and the United States to recover and for our economic growth to spur. But we first need to stop the public policy that directly hurts us. I know I speak on behalf of both the House and the Senate members when I say that we stand ready and eager to provide input and work with our federal partners and the Biden administration. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presentation, which is a video from United States Senator Bill Cassidy. Bear with us. The video will be on your monitors, members.
Senator Bill Cassidy here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for caring about such an essential part of Louisiana's economy, our nation and world's economy, which is the Louisiana oil and gas industry. Clearly, President Biden is changing the playing field. I would argue he's lost sight of that family that's sitting around the kitchen table deciding how to make ends meet. But why do I say that? Look at his first two actions related to oil and gas. Killed the Keystone XL pipeline with an executive order. 11,000 jobs gone. If you speak to the trades folks, they say they need that job. Yes, it was temporary, but every quarter they pay into their retirement is a better retirement for their future. Some of those jobs are permanent, and a lot of them are related to bringing that oil and gas to Louisiana, where they're refined in our refineries. Now, the other action we took was to limit permitting and to limit leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf and other federal lands. And that is estimated to cost potentially 48,000 jobs in Louisiana over the next 2 years. I think the president has lost sight of that family sitting around the kitchen table. By the way, we can all be concerned about global greenhouse gas emissions. Louisiana's coastline, we've suffered more than any as that coastline sinks relative to rising sea levels. But a State Department study from several years ago said that building the Keystone XL pipeline lowers global greenhouse gas emissions because it's a more efficient way to transport the oil coming down to our refineries. The second thing to say is that we are going to produce oil and gas somewhere in the world. You can either produce it in the United States with our environmental standards, or you can do it in a country like Iran, or Russia, or Nigeria, using their environmental standards. And any scientist, any petroleum engineer, any objective person will tell you that the cost to the environment is much greater if you produce it there than if you produce it here. But that said, how can we use this agenda for our purposes? Let's acknowledge there's numerous companies like Dow, Procter & Gamble, who would like to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. If Louisiana can take advantage of some of the good things that's being proposed to make it more worth a while for one of these big companies to locate their services here, that will create jobs. How can we do that? Well, one thing they're looking for is the ability to take carbon out of their processes by carbon capture sequestration. We can do that in Louisiana. We have the right geology. We can store that carbon underground while we get the hydrogen atoms and other things off to make, say, hydrogen cells. And that's important for us. We've got to figure out where to put those pipelines, how to site them, and where to put those storage capacity so that we prepare not just for the federal dollars coming down, but also to attract domestic industry that would like to come someplace to lower their footprint. And this is where Louisiana comes in. We can aid that permitting so it's more efficient, more effective. Our goal is to keep sight of that family sitting around the table, as Louisiana continues to be in the center place of meeting state, national, and global energy demands. We can do that together, even as we look at that which is wrong by what has been done by President Biden already. Let's take advantage of other things that are coming down the pike, not just to mitigate the loss, but to make our future even better. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Next, I'd like to welcome to the floor Congressman Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to join all of you today. We have some slides that I think are going to be showing up on your screens, and just want to run through some of the facts behind kind of the science and data and what the Biden administration is pushing right now. So number one, why are we here today? If you look on your screens, you'll see where President Biden is talking about trying to revitalize the energy industry, trying to build empowering American workers and businesses based upon these new technologies. Specifically, some of the executive orders cover things like trying to reduce emissions, countries, trying to improve access to energy resources, trying to improve the affordability and reliability of energy. And you can see the executive orders that have been issued so far. Things like revoking the Keystone Pipeline, banning or pausing offshore energy production as well as production on federal lands, in some cases even rescinding previously approved permits for oil and gas activities. They also are working to remove what they call subsidies, which is largely just regular tax treatment for businesses associated with oil and gas production. Now, it's important that we understand what the current state of energy is. Right now, if you look at what we're doing out of Louisiana, and this isn't out of the nation, this is out of Louisiana, we're exporting energy to 36 countries around the world out of Louisiana. We're exporting oil to 12 different countries out of Louisiana. This is a huge industry for us. It's an opportunity. It's economic activity. It's helping to address the trade deficit. And of course, importantly, it's providing jobs and income for many families across Louisiana. So if you look at this chart, you'll see on the far right, we actually crossed over not just into energy independence, but net exports in energy last year. Another fact that many people don't fully appreciate, today the United States spends more money on energy research and development than any other country in the world. Okay, I'm going to say that again. We spend more money on energy research and development than any other country in the world, and not just any other country, than every other country in the world combined. The United States is truly setting the standard. It's not just about investing dollars, as you can see in that chart there on the bottom. What that shows is it shows the amount of electricity we're producing, which is the orange or red line, and then it shows the amount of emissions, which is the blue line. So showing you the outcome of this investment, we're producing more electricity with lower emissions. The last time Congress tried to step in and force or direct emissions reduction, it was known as Waxman-Markey. If you look at the chart on the left, you can see that the cost of energy, which is the projected cost, which is the gray line in the middle, that's what was projected to be energy costs moving forward. The red or orange line is what was projected to be the increased cost attributable to Waxman-Markey regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And in reality, we did not pass the law. We let technology and innovation take over, and look at what happened. We reduced emissions more by not regulating. I'm going to say that again. We reduced emissions more by not regulating. On the right side, similar outcome with prices, the projected cost under Waxman-Markey, and the projected, I'm sorry, I've got it backwards. The left side is the cost, the right side is the emissions. So on the right side, once again, lower emissions as a result of not regulating the markets. Today, as a matter of fact, the United States is the global leader in reducing emissions. We have reduced emissions more than any other country in the world, but once again, Mr. Chairman, it's not just about reducing emissions more than every other country. It's more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. All right, so think about that. More than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined. That's what the United States has done, and this shows you what our leadership looks like compared to other countries, UK, Italy, Ukraine, Spain, Japan, France, Germany, all of these other countries, we're reducing more. The director of the International Energy Agency said that what the United States has done over the last 10 years is the greatest reduction in history of energy, so extraordinary efforts. Now, here's what's happening. Everybody appreciates the whole balloon scenario. You squeeze a balloon, it pops out on the sides. What this shows is on the right side in particular, while the United States is reducing emissions, China is going completely in the opposite direction. They are increasing emissions, and under the Paris Accords, this climate agreement that President Biden has re-engaged in, China not only has increased emissions, but they will be allowed to increase emissions another 50% through 2030. As the United States has reduced emissions, every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced, China has increased by 4. If this is a global problem, this is doing absolutely nothing for the globe other than creating dirtier air. Here's another reason why U.S. energy, specifically Louisiana energy, has to be a key to our energy future. Right now, you can look at our regulatory environment. U.S. natural gas, for example, has somewhere between a 41 to 47% lower emissions profile. Speaking another way, for every 1 cubic foot of Russian gas that we displace or supplant, we are reducing emissions by somewhere around 42%. So the more U.S. gas we export, the lower global emissions, not to mention we're displacing Russia's aggressive military and foreign affairs activity all over the globe that are challenging U.S. interests around the globe and those of our allies. Similarly, with Chinese coal, U.S. coal has a 33% lower emissions profile. Once again, the more U.S. coal we export, the lower global emissions we see. Here's another just amazing statistic. President Obama put something called the Clean Power Plan in place. And what he did is he said, we're going to reduce emissions by 35% of a 2005 baseline by 2030. President Trump came in and said, no, we're not doing this. He threw it out. Guess what? As a result of American innovation, we reduced emissions by 2019, hitting that target that President Obama had intended for us to hit by 2030. Again, American innovation, allowing markets to do what they do, technology neutral, we've exceeded even the Obama administration's objectives. Here's an example of what a clean energy future looks like. This is called Net Power. It's a plant in Houston that produces natural gas-fired electricity using something called the alarm cycle. They inject oxygen. They have a carbon sequestration project. It results in natural gas electricity, market prices, zero emissions. Many people have identified oil and gas, what we have abundantly in Louisiana, as being the enemy. The reality is it's the emissions that are causing the problem. And many people, including in the Biden administration, can't separate that. If we can continue to use oil and gas, which have 30 times the energy density of the next closest renewable, and we can capture the emissions, why in the world would we throw this out? It doesn't make any sense. Something that's really important to us here at home, Louisiana, as a result of your activities and the PSC and others, we have the lowest electricity rates in America. Louisiana has the lowest electricity rates in America. You can see a few states on here looking at what other states are doing that have embraced these aggressive climate change policies like being enacted by the current administration. Their electricity rates are double or in some cases triple what we pay at home. Why in the world we would want to replicate that, I have no idea. A few years ago up in New England, Massachusetts specifically, they did not have the natural gas supply because they got rid of their gas pipelines or refused to install them. So what did they do when they needed more heat? They burned home heating oil, greater emissions. They then didn't have enough of that. So you know what they did? They turned to Vladimir Putin to bring in Russian liquefied natural gas. No kidding, into the ports up in Massachusetts, offloaded it, and that's how they heated the homes there. So the alternative, if you're going to go aggressive on these climate change renewable policies, is we can become increasingly dependent upon Russia, greater emissions. Vladimir Putin was literally tweeting, teasing the United States about the fact that he had to come save him. Similarly, in California, the state of California has been very aggressive about implementing climate policies as well. California is the most dependent state in America on imported energy. The most dependent state in America. They've reduced emissions. They're the 43rd best state in the country in terms of reducing emissions, or about the 8th worst in the country in terms of reducing emissions. That's what California's done. Once again, rates are approximately double that of Louisiana, and they're not achieving the next one. All right, great, thanks. So 43rd among states in reducing emissions over the last 10 years. Electricity rates are double those of Louisiana, the highest net importer of electricity or energy, including the majority of it coming from Saudi Arabia, and they have lawsuits from economically distressed groups, the lower income groups, because of their policies causing higher heating and cooling bills. And so look, this isn't my opinion. This is what the facts show, what history shows. As a result of these executive orders, we're going to see higher electricity prices, higher cost to fuel our cars. We're going to see lost revenue sharing for coastal restoration, hurricane protection, and flood control. We're going to see higher delivery costs, and I want to make note, less safe delivery costs, because we're going to be importing more energy, more dependence upon energy supply chains from China, Iran, Iraq, Russia, Nigeria, and other countries, and a net increase in global emissions because these countries have higher emissions profiles than our energy does. This is going to result in, according to API, 2,000 job losses in the energy sector in Louisiana. You think I'm making this up? Look back during the Obama administration. They did well control rule, they did methane rule, they did financial assurance, all of these death by 1,000 cuts, the social cost of carbon, and what happened? We lost 1/3 of the energy jobs in Louisiana. We were able to get some of those back, and we're headed, unfortunately, in the wrong direction again. As history has shown, when you decrease production, you don't decrease demand for those energy supplies. You simply address the delta from imported energy. Why we wouldn't produce it in Louisiana versus Russia, I have no idea. We're going to become more dependent upon foreign energy sources and technologies. It's the wrong direction. For example, in 2006, the U.S. produced about 8% of the global supply of solar panels. China produced 15%, 8% to 15% in 2006. In 2017, China was producing 70% of the solar panels. So we're migrating from a Louisiana-dominant, U.S.-dominant energy source, oil and gas, to one where we're going to be dependent upon Asia. It's the wrong direction. Not only are we going to be dependent upon them for the panels, this shows some of the rare earth and strategic minerals, like some of the oxides and metals. China has a monopoly on these strategic minerals in Asia and in Africa. This is how you build batteries and other technologies. They know what they're doing. They're thinking forward. It undermines our economic security, our national security. The direct impact on Louisiana in regard to revenue sharing, as you know, the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act shares revenues from offshore energy production with the state of Louisiana. Last year, CPRA Chairman Chip Klein picked up a check for approximately $156 million. I don't know what he did with it, but $156 million was just last year. By decreasing this production, you are decreasing investments in coastal restoration and hurricane protection. Look, in closing, I just want to say that if you look at U.S. leadership, the facts and the data show that by producing energy here, you create jobs, you have cleaner energy, you reduce global emissions, we have revenues for our coastal restoration, hurricane protection, and flood control efforts. These are all wins. When you depend upon these other countries, you lose all of those things. You lose the jobs, you lose the economic activity, and you result in greater global emissions. So U.S. energy policy needs to focus on our assets. If you're the CEO of a company, you look at what your strengths are, you look at what your resources are, and you build a plan based upon that. This plan is built upon the strategic advantages of other countries. Think for just a minute, Mr. Chairman, if when LSU was winning the national championship undefeated, if somebody came out and said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and switch out Coach O and Joe Burrow. Can you imagine what the public would have said? Can you imagine the response? What would you have said? I mean, to think about that for just a minute. We are leading the world. We are leading the world, and we're doing it with our assets, our resources, and you're talking about a plan that would come in and totally pivot when evidence shows it would result in worse environmental, worse economic outcomes. It's the wrong direction. So looking forward to working with y'all, working with Congressman Higgins and our delegation to ensure that we can show the data, show the facts, and push energy policy in a direction that actually represents the Louisiana's interest and America's interest moving forward. So, thank you.
Would you mind taking a question? Thank you. Senator Allen would like to ask you, but he's going to come to the well.
Congressman Graves, thank you so much for being engaged in this. My question is more of a down-home question for Louisiana. I mean, I've been on budget committees here since I got here. GOMESA, which you were instrumental in getting passed, which increased our revenue share of offshore revenues, was the source of what we were going to use to restore our coast. You touched on it briefly. But without these funds, with the Biden administration taking the knees out of this fund source, number one, how are we going to restore our coast? And number two, the $1.4 billion that the federal government says we owe them for the fortification of the levees below New Orleans after Katrina, you know, they spent $14 billion and they sent us a bill for a $1.2 or $1.4 billion. GOMESA was also going to be a revenue source to repay that. So how they expect us to restore our coast and pay them back for the levees that were built in New Orleans if we don't have the revenue source to do it?
Senator, it's a really good point. I noted earlier that $156 million was the check last year. We expected in the future for that number to go up. We have been working in both the House and Senate, Congressman Richmond and I, as well as Senator Cassidy, working on legislation to increase the future shares for Louisiana. We've passed it through committees in the past on a bipartisan basis. So there's no doubt this kneecaps our coastal program in Louisiana. And the short-sightedness of it, Senator, is that when you look back, I mean, there are all sorts of studies that show for every $1 you invest through CPRA's program, the master plan, you receive on the low end somewhere around $4 in cost savings for every $1 you invest. On the high end, they've been able to demonstrate $12 to even $16 in savings for $1 being invested. So not only are you stopping the restoration, the resiliency of our coastal communities, you also are going to result in greater federal expenditures in the future through FEMA and other disaster agencies. Offshore revenues are the second highest source of revenue for the U.S. Treasury behind taxes. And so this isn't just limited to restoration. This is your transportation programs, your environmental programs, your healthcare programs, your education. All of these things are going to be lost. And where's this revenue going? It's going to higher energy prices, largely to overseas energy supply lines. It really is, based on facts and data, it's the wrong direction. In regard to the payback of the hurricane protection system in the 5 parishes around the New Orleans area, it certainly does contribute to the financial problems, paying that back, and we're going to continue to be working to push against this. But look, something that's really important to understand, even the messaging, the front page of the newspaper around the United States saying that Biden bans oil and gas, that puts a huge chill effect on investment. And I don't expect them to come out and say, we're stopping all oil and gas. It is going to be death by 1,000 cuts. This whole social cost of carbon concept. I mean, that is the most arbitrary mechanism to try and count or quantify the cost of different regulatory actions. They're going to kill the energy industry indirectly, but as a result of what they're trying to do. So it is critical that we stand up and show how the facts, the data, the science show a different direction as being the best solution.
Thank you, Senator Ala. Representative Mincy, you have a question for the Congressman?
Good morning, Congressman. First of all, I want to thank you for your continued leadership in D.C., and thank you for being with us today. Your presence alone shows your commitment to this issue as well as commitment to our state, so thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You've always been a champion for coastal protection, restoration, and flood protection, and we spoke a little bit about those executive orders and how that's going to affect us. Specifically, can you elaborate any on how this would affect us from like the Morganza to the Gulf and also the co-meet in the Capital Region area?
Absolutely. So, Representative Mincy, right now the Morganza to the Gulf project, it is the largest Corps of Engineers project in the nation. The authorization on it is somewhere around $14 billion. The entire National Corps of Engineers backlog's just under $100 billion. So this is a huge part of that backlog and the offshore energy revenues. And look, while Go Mesa, the energy revenue sharing is a big part of it, keep in mind, this is the revenue stream, the taxes for the parishes. This is what funds, quite frankly, the Coastal Trust Fund is funded from energy production. That's how they fund their operating budget. And so you are going to see a huge chill effect, not just on the ability to fund capital projects like Morganza to the Gulf or moving forward on some of the other Capital Region projects we're working on, enhancements to the co-meet project, concepts like, and I know it's got some problems, but concepts like the Darlington Reservoir, the resources will not be there for those types of projects. And so, we connected long ago or established a relationship between energy production, oil and gas production, and our resiliency of our coastal communities and communities all over South Louisiana. Under the state's constitution, every penny of the revenues that are received go into the flood control, the hurricane protection, and the coastal restoration efforts in the state. And so by stopping the production, you stop the revenue stream. We're already projecting a decrease for this year as a result below the $156 million we received last year. So it ends up being really a backward strategy because it's going to result in higher federal expenditures picking up the pieces as we saw in 2016 from the flood that occurred in your region. And so this really is a backwards policy. It doesn't achieve any of the objectives in terms of emissions, cost, reliability, any of it. And it has further impacts like the flood control, hurricane protection, and coastal restoration in Louisiana.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Representative Mincy. Senator Hewitt, we have 2 more questions for you, Congressman, and then you're off the hook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on this issue. You know, 2 years ago, I was with you at the Capitol, at the U.S. Capitol, at your invitation to testify before a U.S. subcommittee. And as you recall, what was being considered at that time was legislation that was going to stop seismic activity and leasing activity in the Gulf and the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic. And we talked about a lot of these same topics that now it appears what they couldn't do legislatively 2 years ago, Biden is trying to do through executive order. And I think, you know, one of the most compelling facts that we talked about at that hearing and that I presented on a slide was looking at the supply and demand forecast from the International Energy Agency. And if you remember, it showed a 20-year forecast, the demand for energy and the supply forecast for 20 years. So the supply showed a definite growth in solar and wind and renewable energies. And then fossil fuels had to make up the gap. And fossil fuels, they said at that time, in 2040 was going to have to be 50% of the world's energy to meet the demand. And so my question is, I mean, that didn't come from us or from API or any oil and gas entity. This is the International Energy Agency's forecast. So how can the Biden administration decide to chop off the knees of the oil and gas industry when clearly there is a huge need for them to continue to supply a significant amount of the world's energy? And so my ask of you, and I don't expect you to be able to speak for the administration, but have you seen any evidence or any forecast? I mean, they talk about, let's base it on the science and the facts. I don't understand how you can chop off one source of energy when the other ones are not ready to step up to the plate and fill the gap.
Yeah. Senator, you made an excellent point. I want to thank you again for coming to testify before our committee. So, you know, let's hit 2 things here. So number one, let's be clear. I think that all of us support renewable energy. We have a big solar farm that was built over in West Baton Rouge, down in St. Charles Parish. Valero and Darling Ingredients are doing this green diamond diesel, using 100% renewable diesel from plants, from animal renderings and other things that you can interchange with regular diesel. 75% of it's going to California. They're going to be building another green diesel project in West Baton Rouge. These are all great when they make economic sense, and they're going to continue to play a role in our energy future. But it is also very clear with those intermittent sources like wind and solar, you've got to have the base load like natural gas, nuclear, and others to supply. You're exactly right that looking forward, that energy demand, I mean, keep in mind some countries around the world, they don't even have energy. And energy demand, as transmission lines grow and development occurs, energy demand is going to increase in an extraordinary way. The natural gas plays the largest role in addressing the energy demands around the globe today, and to take that away, you do not have the development or the deployment capability to put renewables in those spots. It's impossible, and so you're exactly right. This is just a strategy, and look, I want to be clear, this isn't political. This is just data. This is black and white numbers that show what's happened historically, what's going to happen moving forward if we continue down this path. It's not in the U.S. interest. And just to give you one example of how you've got to think through some of these solutions a little bit better. If we try, as some people in Congress have, to try to require electric vehicles across the board, universal application of electric vehicles, you're going to have to triple or maybe even quadruple electricity generation. Our current transmission system, even though we have 2 nuclear power plants in Louisiana and other facilities, we cannot generate it, we can't transmit it. These are fundamental problems, and everybody, it's like operating on blind faith and just moving in this religious direction of renewable energy without thinking about practically how you do it, how you lay out the strategy and steps, and the implications on Louisiana and the rest of the country, which of course are adverse. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hewitt. Senator Connick?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Good to see you again.
You too.
Without a doubt, the change in the administration has caused the crippling of this industry. What is the reasoning? What is the president saying about what's happening in Louisiana? Is there a solution, or does he not care, or can we reverse some of this?
So let's keep in mind, there were dozens of executive orders that were written and that were released, I think written before, but were released in just the first few days of the administration. So I think these things had been on the shelf, they were ready to go, and I think that this was really signaling, and I think virtue signaling in some cases, and having the chill effect on investment in the industry. I think it's adding fuel to this ESG concept, environmental and social governance concept you're seeing take off across Wall Street. So I don't think that they're truly thinking about what is the outcome economically and otherwise. I think that this was, sort of this ideology that many folks on the more liberal side have. I think that they believe that this is the right thing, but it's sort of we're here and they're looking at this sort of unicornish objective over here and not thinking about the practical implications or the steps to get there. As I said, I think that their objectives are reducing emissions, creating jobs, increasing access to affordable energy, boosting energy, the economy, and improving the reliability of U.S. energy. But when you start going through and looking at the strategic steps forward, you actually undermine every single one of those goals. And so I'm hopeful that as we move forward and they get their administration stood up, we're able to show them, just from a science perspective and from a historical perspective, what happens when you do these things, and the outcomes are very different than what they're trying to achieve. And I'll give you an example. I've repeatedly offered amendments to legislation, climate legislation, that said, yes, you can do all these things. You can require solar, you can require electric cars and all these things, except if these policies would result in greater global emissions because people are moving their operations to China, India, Mexico, and less efficient countries in regard to emissions, so if it results in greater global emissions, then you can't do this. And do you know that every single time I've offered that amendment, the sponsors of the bill have opposed my amendment? They know that this results in greater emissions. I've offered amendments that have said if this is going to increase the cost of electricity and have a disproportionate impact on our impoverished community members, then this would not go into effect. Do you know that they voted against it every single time? And I could go on, net job loss, economic activity being sent overseas, affecting the trade deficit. Every single time they oppose my amendments that demonstrate how their objectives are actually undermined by the legislation that they're pushing.
Congressman, we want to thank you for taking the time to show up in person and welcome you again to the Capitol. You're off the hook, and thank you for the work you're doing for your district.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now y'all get the more entertaining Congressman Higgins.
I would like to welcome to the House floor Congressman Clay Higgins, representing the 3rd Congressional District. Congressman Higgins, welcome to the Louisiana House of Representatives.
Thank you, Chairman. It's always great to follow my friend and colleague, Garrett Graves, the only gentleman in Congress who can deliver an hour-and-a-half PowerPoint in 20 minutes. His points regarding the failed science of the intent, the alleged intent behind the executive orders that we're discussing in part today is exactly on target. Our offices have worked together to prepare packets of scientific data that's available to each of you. You can contact my office at clayhiggins.house.gov, and we will send you digital copies of whatever you need to deliver this message back to your constituents and to advance the cause of reason. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Louisiana Senate and House Natural Resources Committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I'm here on behalf of the thousands of families in Louisiana whose livelihoods are dependent on the oil and gas industry. I don't need to stress to any of you the importance of the oil and gas industry in Louisiana. The industry accounts for over 70 billion of our state's GDP and supports nearly 250,000 Louisiana jobs. That means the oil and gas industry supports 1 in 9 jobs in our states. These are good jobs that provide Louisiana families with economic stability and security, jobs that provide a service that keeps our nation running and our homes heated and cooled. It's no secret in Louisiana that the industry has been plagued for some time now by state-based regulations. These old rules and frame of thought and taxes have resulted in an exodus of jobs and businesses across our state into our neighboring states like Texas. Failure to address these self-imposed shortfalls will continue to result in Louisiana's best and brightest citizens leaving our state for good, perhaps, to find opportunity elsewhere. We must stand together as your congressional delegation and our colleagues on both sides of the aisle serving here in our state's capital. We must work with our executive administrations in Baton Rouge and in D.C. together as Americans first and Louisiana citizens to address the realities of the challenges that we face, some of which are created of our own design. We must stand together and share our minds and hearts and focus our energies on how to overcome some of the unnecessary challenges that we have burdened our own citizens with here in Louisiana and across the country. While the state legislature has been supportive of initiatives to alleviate some of these burdens and to address our state's somewhat toxic legal environment, I believe more needs to be done. As of today, our governor has been rather unwilling to address these issues head on. Further, the constitutionally questionable, I say that kindly, statewide COVID restrictions and the lingering consequences of last year's price war with Saudi Arabia and Russia have put added pressures on the oil and gas industry that are uniquely felt here in Louisiana. The COVID-19 virus didn't destroy our economy and severely wound the oil and gas industry on its own. Oppression of freedoms and an unwillingness to modernize our state's laws has impacted just as much as the virus itself and injured the citizens we're sworn to serve. While these state issues are known, we're also currently faced with an onslaught of unknown federal regulations. It's going to get worse. While the Trump administration did a fantastic job of overturning onerous and misguided regulations, unnecessary, injurious, sometimes targeted against the oil and gas industry, we're now faced with President Biden's administration, who has quite an alternate opinion of the oil and gas industry. Upon taking office last month, the Biden administration wasted no time launching a full-scale assault on oil and gas. Through executive decree, President Biden is pushing job-killing energy policies that will send production overseas and further injure America's economy. Sadly, this is just the beginning. In the first 2 weeks, we've seen the administration revoke permits for the Keystone XL pipeline, enact drilling moratorium for federal lands and waters, rejoin the misguided Paris Agreement, and begin implementing Green New Deal standards. These executive policies do not represent the best interests of the American people, certainly not the citizens of Louisiana. They will immediately result in the destruction of American jobs, higher energy costs, the loss of American energy dominance, and they will undermine our global security by reducing America's influence with nation states across the earth. The world runs on oil and gas energy. Petroleum-based products are used to produce virtually everything, everywhere. Those who will benefit the most from President Biden's executive orders include Russia and China. This shift in policy has been carried out in the name of conservation and environmentalism. However, as my colleague Garrett pointed out with his PowerPoint, the argument that this helps our climate is absurd. Oil and gas production won't end. We'll only move overseas where it's far less regulated. Sending energy production to countries with horrible ecological records is the worst thing we can do for our climate. It's not just bad for America and Louisiana, it's bad for the world. American innovation is driving emissions reductions worldwide. As an industry-heavy state, Louisiana is a global leader in this effort, in large part because of the advent of LNG. Private companies are running cleaner operations, and that's not happening through government mandates. It's happening because innovation is good for business. The result is cleaner, more efficient fuel production. The President, in my humble opinion, should be taking action to encourage growth, to create new jobs, and to bolster America's energy security. However, the Biden administration's action not only destroy existing jobs, but also ensure that pre-pandemic production levels may never return. This is a reality we must face. President Biden seems determined to destroy America's energy dominance. If fully enacted, the radical Biden climate agenda will cost upwards of 6 million American jobs. This is a real number that's frightening. Could cost the United States economy trillions of dollars in productivity. We'll move this money and this business, these jobs, overseas. In Congress, I'll continue to push back against this war on the oil and gas industry. I'll closely work with other members of your Louisiana delegation. We stand strongly together. We are a small delegation. We each have unique and varied backgrounds, but we are extremely respectful of each other. We communicate on a daily basis. I would say I'm in some level of deep communication with one of my colleagues from your Louisiana delegation. I cannot think of a state that has a more solid and unified shoulder-to-shoulder approach to serving the citizens of our state and, by extension, our nation. That includes, of course, my friend Representative Graves. We face these things head-on. My office will pursue every legally available action and support legislation that protects American workers and their livelihoods. As a state, we're faced with great challenges in the road ahead. Together, we can overcome those challenges and push Louisiana into solid economic prosperity and a beautiful and bright future for our children and grandchildren. In these efforts, I am your ally and at your avail. Thank you again for having me here today and for allowing me to address this joint session committee. And I'm at your avail to respond to any questions.
Congressman, thank you. The good news about not having a PowerPoint presentation is that you do get less questions. But you do have a question from one of your constituents, Representative DeVilliers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Higgins,
morning,
for coming
sir.
here today. Good morning. I really appreciate you taking your time to come here and visit with us today. One of the things that I'm hearing a lot from our constituents is, they're struggling with the fact that they could possibly lose their job from working offshore. And they're really and truthfully looking for you and I for, I guess, answers and solutions as far as policy goes. Knowing what's going on in D.C., and obviously you know what's going on in Louisiana as well, do you have maybe some suggestions on what we can do policy-wide, or maybe to address bringing jobs that are going to be lost offshore, maybe on land? And one of the things that comes to mind is we have a lot of orphan wells in the state of Louisiana. And I've enjoyed working across the aisle with our senators on trying to find solutions to address these problems. And talking to people in the industry, they're telling me that some of the same equipment they use to drill for oil and gas wells, they can use to go in and plug these orphan wells and clean up these sites. So I don't know if there's just some ideas that you can give us. You know, we're going to be going into session in a couple of months, and we have time to maybe draft some legislation that would help bring our people to work back into the state of Louisiana. And I'll thank you for any suggestions you have. Thank you again for coming today.
Yes, sir, Representative. And the creative intellect of our workforce, our industry champions across South Louisiana, always find a way. I'm friends with a gentleman named Lee Dragner from Morgan City. He was in the barge building business for the oil and gas industry, and when the oil and gas industry took a turn in the wrong direction, he began bidding on contracts with this new company called SpaceX to build barges, custom barges for SpaceX endeavors. Nobody knew who SpaceX was back then. Now those guys are sending up, you know, they're going into orbit every month and landing rockets. Never been done before. You're bringing it back and landing them. So now, you know, Lee Dragner's company, just to use that as an example, he's not doing any oil and gas industry work. He's got like 5 years of business lined up, all the work he can handle for specialty barges, because once the name got out there, once his reputation got out there, his orders started coming in from around the world. This specialty barge, that specialty barge, etc. So the creative intellect, I believe, collectively of our citizens, based upon generations of finding ways to make things work in the oil and gas industry. I believe that's the same fuel that will feed the energy of thought and creativity that will help us develop jobs that currently don't exist to replace those that could be permanently lost. But whereas that is true, let me back up, because I'm not stepping away from the fight to keep the jobs that we've got. And regarding President Biden, this is a gentleman that has been an elected official for 48 years. You know, he's not a radical communist man. He's more cut from the cloth of, say, a President Bill Clinton type Democrat. He's a guy that I believe we can work with. Did I oppose his election? Absolutely. But this is America. We're a constitutionalist representative republic. He's the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief. He's the executive of our nation. And we must be able to work with our executive, just as we work with our executives here in Baton Rouge. So I believe that if we join forces and become sort of force multipliers for each other with our offices, where your congressional delegation stands together with the state legislators and address specific executive actions that are injurious to Louisiana and to our economy in ways that at President Biden, it might not have been really put on his desk. You know, he might not quite get it. I believe if we join our voices together officially and present the right sort of communication, either back channel or official, but together, and get it in front of President Biden's administration in the right way, I think he'll be responsive. You know, you don't make it into, you don't get reelected for 48 years by smashing everyone's interest and ignoring their reasonable pleas. So, although I certainly did oppose President Biden's election, that's behind us now. You know, we have to look at ways to work within, even though he's doing some very injurious things, and he's writing more executive orders than any president ever has historically, and many of them are certainly injurious to Louisiana. I believe we can surgically approach these things, and we increase our significance in his presence, and maybe get some solid response from him to amend or adjust some of his administrative agenda that would help save jobs in Louisiana right now. That combined with creative thoughts and process, and my office is at your avail individually, sir, all of you. I tell my colleague all the time, Colonel Greg Ellison, between the two of us, we make one smart guy. So we're happy to sit down and work with you on specific endeavors to save jobs that currently exist, and to look at ways to create new jobs that have not existed. Thank you for that question, sir.
Thank you, Representative de Villiers. Congressman, I think you hit the nail on the head. It starts with the innovation of our workers and our people and their creativity, and we'll work with you on the public policy to support them. So thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. God bless.
Members, next to the House floor, I'm inviting Secretary Tom Harris, the Department of Natural Resources. Secretary Harris, welcome to the House.
I do appreciate this opportunity to address the committee. I've had a lot of questions over the last few weeks, some of them from members of this body, on what the governor's doing. We heard the governor's actions questioned already this morning, and I really appreciate the opportunity to address that. First thing, I'd really like to make clear that Governor Edwards is and has been actively engaged in pushing back on the leasing moratorium. He's been making the case that cutting domestic production is not the way forward, and it won't achieve the results that the Biden administration appears to believe that it will. It's not that we disagree with the president's goal in reducing carbon emissions. It's just we believe there are better tools to achieve those goals, tools that do not have such a dramatic negative impact on our economy. Since the day the presidential executive action was taken, the governor has been on the phone. He's been meeting in person with CEOs and industry leaders, listening to the concerns. He's been reaching out to his fellow governors, both Democrat and Republican, those that share his concerns with this order. He's been on the phone with members of Congress looking for support. I know he's had at least 3 calls with Senator Manchin and with several other senators and congressmen, local and across the country. More importantly, I think, Governor Edwards has been reaching out to new members of the Biden administration, arguing Louisiana's case. Just Monday, Governor Edwards spoke with President Biden's DOE Secretary nominee, Jennifer Granholm, to express his concerns. I understand that was a very productive call. Governor Edwards was expressing his concerns with that order and proposing an alternate path forward, one that we're already following here in Louisiana. What Governor Edwards has not been doing, something you will most certainly not hear him do is to make public inflammatory comments that would impair his effectiveness in getting a seat at the table and having our legitimate concerns heard. Instead, he's trying to have actual influence on federal energy policy moving forward in a way that most benefits the state of Louisiana. I would like to point out that over the past 4 years, you have not seen Governor Edwards throw bricks or insults at President Trump. I don't expect him to start doing that with President Biden. First of all, it's not his style. But more importantly, he doesn't believe it to be an effective approach to being heard by the new administration. Certainly, you could argue that an adversarial approach could result in an outcome for Louisiana we definitely do not want. I think all of us here in Louisiana already know how critical the offshore industry is to our state, to our economy, and to our people. We also know how much domestic production of traditional fuel means to the rest of the country. Part of our task here is to remind the Biden administration of that. We recognize that sensitivities of national and world economies have shifted, and the management of carbon, including reductions in the amount of carbon emissions that we generate, have simply become part of doing business in a global economy, not by executive fiat, but by market demand. While Louisiana recognizes the value and necessity of taking strong action to combat climate change, an artificial reduction of domestic supply does not really achieve that end, and instead creates potential to destabilize the nation's energy infrastructure and energy security, increase energy costs, and put thousands of Americans out of work for no real environmental gain. There is a USGS report that's been cited to make the case that fossil fuel production from federal lands and offshore amounts to 25% of carbon emissions. I believe that statistic is a little bit misleading. The math only really works if you include emissions from industrial consumption, electrical production, and consumption for transportation as part of that equation. In other words, carbon emissions are a factor of how the fuel is consumed, not how it's supplied. Reducing domestic supply would not change the demand for this consumption. It would only alter where it was supplied from. That same report shows that actual extraction emissions from federal lands are less than 1% of carbon emissions, both total U.S. emissions and emissions associated with federal lands. And in this case, we can, we have, and we will argue to President Biden's administration that acting to cut offshore production would be counterproductive to their stated aim of reducing carbon, while having devastating impacts to Louisiana's economy. There was a 2016 Department of the Interior report on current Gulf leasing that noted that greenhouse gas emissions would be little impacted by new leases in production, and that emissions could increase slightly without leasing as foreign sources of oil that would fill in for the reduced outer continental shelf supply, and the production and transport of that foreign oil would create more emissions. Gulf outer continental shelf operations produce oil with exceptionally lower greenhouse gas intensity for many reasons. Higher grade oil, which needs less processing, methane leaks that are more tightly controlled for safety reasons, flaring and venting that is virtually banned in the Gulf, and we have pipelines that ship oil directly to the refineries instead of round-trip transport in tankers. We do not have to choose between reducing emissions and meeting energy needs. We can do both. That's exactly what Governor Edwards is proposing to the Biden administration, using every avenue available. Louisiana has already been moving forward, taking steps to better manage carbon emissions, in partnership with other states and with industry, and doing so without acting to reduce domestic drilling and production. In fact, a cornerstone in Governor Edwards' pushback against any pause in offshore leasing is that we already are working cooperatively with industry to address and reduce CO2 emissions through our work in the Climate Initiatives Task Force, in our cooperative efforts with industry to bring investment in carbon sequestration to Louisiana. The Louisiana Climate Task Force has brought NGOs, industry, and government together to work on reducing emissions and ensuring that Gulf states and workforces remain strong as global demand for low-carbon products grow. Louisiana has a mix of natural structures and man-made assets already in place here to make for a great potential opportunity for industry making use of evolving laws and tax breaks for carbon capture and storage. Louisiana is home to one of the world's largest concentrations of industrial facilities, providing carbon dioxide capture opportunities in close proximity to one another and located near deep, well-confined geologic storage options. With our existing industrial and pipeline transportation expertise and infrastructure, Louisiana could position itself as a leading regional hub for a carbon dioxide pipeline network to store carbon deep below ground instead of allowing it to continue to build up in the atmosphere. This is not coming out of nowhere. Under Governor Edwards' leadership, we've been working with national and international carbon management initiatives for several years. At the same time, our Office of Conservation has spent the last 2 years putting us in a position to get approval from EPA to get permitting and enforcement authority to regulate carbon injection in Class 6 wells at the state level. We're on track to gain primacy for the Class 6 well injection program as soon as the fourth quarter of this year, making Louisiana only the third state in the country to achieve that regulatory primacy for the program. If you don't believe this is happening already, you need look no further than the October 2020 announcement and permit application by Gulf Coast Sequestration in Calcasieu for a carbon sequestration project that'll take advantage of the $50 a ton federal tax credit under the 45Q program. In November of 2020, the world's largest ammonia producer, CF Industries, announced a project in Donaldsonville to produce a green or low carbon ammonia and to capture their carbon dioxide emissions. This low CO2 emission process is not only the right thing to do for the environment, it also results in a low carbon product that sells for a premium on the open market. Also in November of 2020, Grand Fuels, someone mentioned earlier, signed a lease at the Port of West Baton Rouge and announced a $9.2 billion project to build a renewable fuels refinery utilizing soybean and canola oils to produce 60,000 barrels a day of low-carbon renewable diesel, providing high-paying refinery jobs and a market for Louisiana farmers, while capturing and sequestering their carbon emissions. This diesel is made from agricultural products like soybeans that directly capture carbon dioxide from the air. Grand Fuels will capture and sequester their CO2 emissions from the refinery stacks. They'll get the benefits of the 45Q tax credits for sequestration and be able to sell their negative carbon diesel at a premium on the market. These companies, they could have gone anywhere to build these facilities. They chose Louisiana for our geology, our infrastructure, our predictable regulatory framework, our workforce, and because we told them that they were welcomed here. Our Office of Conservation and State Energy Office are meeting with 2 to 5 companies a week who are looking at Louisiana for investment in CCUS projects. And we're working with Don Pearson and his staff at Economic Development to bring those projects here to Louisiana. The message we're bringing to the federal government is that the production of traditional fuels is not the primary issue to address in dealing with carbon management efforts, and that acting to suppress production in the near term only weakens our ability to provide jobs, provide affordable energy, and provide for critical environmental efforts. Methods such as CCUS and other consumption-in strategies are a better and more direct approach to dealing with concerns about carbon emissions. Finally, last week, in a meeting with industry leaders, Governor Edwards instructed me to draft a letter for a signature in which we'll ask the Department of the Interior to continue issuing permits on existing leases in the Gulf of Mexico. We're working with Lamoga staff to best craft that language for the governor's letter. Thank you for this opportunity. I do look forward to continuing to work with you while representing Governor Edwards. I believe that together we can continue to make great things happen here in Louisiana. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity. I would love to appear before your committees and talk a little bit about what we've done in the area of carbon capture and bring some of my staff with you at your convenience.
We'd love to have you, and we intend on doing that. Secretary Harris, we do have a question from Chairman Henskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for keeping me up to date. I think the suspension was signed on January the 26th on a Tuesday, and you were in my office at 8:30 in the morning explaining to me what y'all been pushing back on, what y'all been trying to do. You probably know my one big question because I've asked it to you for 3 times. And that is, Mr. Secretary, we have to admit the governor's in a unique position. He is the only Democratic governor in the Southeast Conference. Has he made the personal phone call to the president to explain to him what this means to our economy, our environment, and our coast? Has he made that phone call?
Senator, thank you for that question. I don't know the answer to that. I am aware of numerous calls and contacts with members of President Biden's administration. I have no doubt in my mind that if he were able to have that conversation, if he hasn't yet, he'll be doing so at the earliest opportunity.
Because I mean, that's very important. And I want to also say that we're not throwing bricks. There's a difference between throwing bricks and standing firm. And I think the legislature is trying to stand firm for Louisiana, our oil and gas industry, and our environment. The last president probably didn't try to shut down the oil and gas industry either. So I understand that, but there's a difference between throwing bricks, I think, and standing firm. And I just want to make sure that the asks are tough and the replies are good. And so how have been the comebacks to the ask been so far?
I believe we're making progress. This is a pause, and I don't think pauses in federal agencies are particularly uncommon at the beginning of a new administration. I think the nature, the very loud and public forum for this pause is what's most concerning. That's unusual. I don't remember seeing it being handled in that manner before. But we're working with the administration and trying to impact whatever the final federal energy policy is going to be. And I think that's the most important. We can all live with almost anything for 60 days. We're still producing oil out there. The bits are still turning. But it's what comes next.
Are we more concerned of going back to where we were before January the 26th instead of modifying what they want to do? Does anyone in the administration think in 60 days it's going to be as good as it was on January the 25th for the oil and gas industry in Louisiana?
Senator, I'm very confident that the governor is working with the administration to get absolutely the very best deal that he can for Louisiana and the very best outcome for our economy.
So are we pushing back to go back to January the 25th?
I have not sat in on those calls. I have been briefed. I know that the reception to his the reaction to his calls has been very receptive, and the administration does seem willing to work with Governor Edwards.
And you talk about throwing bricks, and let me ask another question. I know the governor of New Mexico in the past has said she may ask for a waiver from this. Are we looking into that? Is that on the table for offshore?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not an attorney. I personally don't know if that discussion is going on. I know the governor prefers to work cooperatively with the administration in getting what's best for Louisiana. I don't know if he thinks that legal challenges are the way to go. Again, I'm not an attorney, but it's kind of like the argument that you're a carpenter and you're going to sue your neighbor because he's not building a second-story addition to his house because that would give you work. I don't know what legal standing there is to make such a challenge on federal
Like
lands.
federal overreach, maybe? Maybe federal overreach into the state?
Again, sir, I'm not an attorney.
Okay. That's all I have. All I ask Secretary Harris, and not from me, is to ask the governor for the people of the state of Louisiana to make that phone call. It can only help, and I would hope we get to that point.
I
Thank you,
hope
Mr.
so
Chairman.
too, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Secretary, I have a question from Representative Landry.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but I'm just looking at the language of the order, and it says the Secretary shall pause new leases pending completion of a comprehensive review and reconsideration. I was wondering if they've shared with y'all what this, I would guess, temporary review and consideration means, how long it might last, any information you might have on what will happen while this pause is in place.
The immediate impact that I'm aware of from this pause is there was a lease sale for the central Gulf of Mexico scheduled for, and please don't quote me on this, I believe the date was February 27th or sometime early in March. To my knowledge, that lease sale will not be held. In the meantime, existing federal leases will continue to continue production. Any permits already issued will be allowed to drill. There is a question, there's a list of probably about 40 actions that require prior federal authorization that fall to a lower level than a permit. We're also working to try to get clarification on which of those activities are going to be kicked up to a higher level, to an assistant secretary at the Department of Interior, as opposed to the level that that they've traditionally been handled at. I think missing out on a lease sale is going to hurt our coastal restoration activities, certainly hurt the state budget, but the most important action we can take is try to impact federal policy moving forward. Representative Landry, I don't know if that answered your question sufficiently. I'd be glad to take another stab.
Partially. I guess it was two questions in one. The second would be, what is this comprehensive review and reconsideration of leasing practice that's referenced here? Is that going to be like a task force, a committee? I'm just wondering what that might look like in practical terms.
I don't think they've announced what format that's going to take. I do have several friends that work for federal agencies, took that path out of college, and a review upon a new administration coming into office is pretty common. It's not normally publicly announced. It's just something that happens. Those of us that have watched the Department of Interior over the years have noticed a slowdown, the first couple of months of every administration. They just never tell us why.
And do they usually publicly issue those findings in your experience?
I've never seen them. That's not to say they're not published as a report or in the very deep in the Federal Register. I've never bothered to.
Okay. Well, if you do find out any information on what this review and reconsideration might mean, I would appreciate receiving it from you.
I will commit to getting those to you if and when they're released.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Landry. Representative DeVilliers, looks like that's our last question, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Harris, I know, and you're aware, I've called you multiple times about different investments, people wanting to invest in the state of Louisiana as far as in the oil and gas industry. I know the discussion today is centered around the federal leases and things of that nature. My question to you is, from our conversations, not only about new leases in the state, but can you give us maybe some suggestions on what we can do legislatively, whether it's dealing with tax rates, whether it's dealing with coastal lawsuits, legacy lawsuits, things of that nature, stripper wells, full rate wells, incapable wells, orphan wells. There's got to be something we can do legislatively to bring jobs back home. And you had mentioned two things in your letter you were reading. One was about providing jobs, and the other one was they're going to alter where the supply comes from. I have to think we have a good supply of oil and gas right here in the state of Louisiana, and I would just like to hear some suggestions on what we could do legislatively to try to bring those jobs back home. Thank you
for that question, Representative Villiers. I always look forward to your calls and your questions. You're absolutely right. First of all, I agree that I would like to see, and I believe the governor absolutely would greatly prefer to see oil produced here in Louisiana or offshore from Louisiana's coast to provide not only GOMESA income, but jobs and other indirect sources of revenue. As far as what this body can do as a legislature to attract new business, I spent 20 years at DEQ before coming to DNR, and it's been my observation that more than anything else, industry despises uncertainty. They can deal with just about anything if they can plan for it, if the rules don't change. And towards that end, one thing I think would be extremely helpful as CEOs make decisions, particularly in moving towards carbon sequestration, towards investment in Louisiana, if the legislature were able to take Governor Edwards' climate initiatives, climate goals, and put those into statute, I think that would give CEOs and companies a level of certainty on where Louisiana was headed moving forward, and allow them to commit their company's resources to investment here. It's that uncertainty on the rules that really is an inhibition to investment. I know from the regulatory perspective, we've done everything we can to make it a very transparent and predictable regulatory process here in the state. And I believe that's helped. I believe that's helped a great deal in providing comfort and incentive for Louisiana's for companies to make investments here in Louisiana. Did that answer your question, Representative de Villiers? Well, thank you. I don't consider myself a politician, sir.
Representative de Villiers, you have a follow-up?
Just a statement. I know you said, does that answer my question? I mean, we bring a lot of policies here, and you talked a lot about jobs and where they kind of moving around, whether it's through plants and things of that nature. But our last phone call was on a $1 billion investment in the state of Louisiana, and one of the concerns they had was the orphan wells that were situated in this field. And as we're well aware, that's basically a liability of the state of Louisiana. And what I'm asking you directly, and you don't have to answer it right now, but if you can maybe think about it and give us something that we can work on, is policies that'll help bring these investments back to Louisiana, not only for jobs, but it'll also help clean up some of these liabilities that are on the state of Louisiana. So,
Representative Villiers, I couldn't agree more. The orphan wells in Louisiana are a liability for the state. They discourage new investment. I know we've had several conversations. I've had more conversations with Senator Allen on this subject than I can even remember or list. It's a problem, and I look forward to working with the legislature, trying to come up with new ideas on how we can address this. It's something that could only help the state moving forward if we're able to come up with some path forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative DeVilliers. Senator Fazy.
Thank you. Secretary Harris, I realize you brought us some information, but what we need is facts. As of right now, canceling the pipeline, there's jobs already being canceled everywhere. Me being in the pipeline business, that puts us at status that we've had a number of projects already canceled. So you're saying 60 days and well, no more and all, but what I'd like to know is facts is what are we going to get done to go ahead and save our jobs, and I need to know also who's going to pay for the next 60 days or 90 days or however long it takes to get this straight, because people are hurting. We're coming out of this year of COVID and jobs and cutting people's hours and laying people off. We were just getting things kicked back off, and then we have this these executive orders come down and kill our industry. So we need to move fast. We don't have 60 days. We don't have 90 days. So I just want to ask, when can you come back with some facts that we're going to get some real answers? Thank you.
And good to talk to you again, Senator Fazy. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that none of the branches of Louisiana government can mandate what the federal government's going to do, particularly in the area of executive action. I think the best thing we can do is make a coherent argument that what they're proposing is not an optimal path forward. It's not even close. It's counterproductive. That we have a better idea. Here's an approach that will have immediate impact on carbon emissions without killing jobs, without killing Louisiana's offshore oil industry. I think the best thing we can do is to argue as hard as we can, as Chairman Hinskin says, ask hard questions and demand answers. But that's the only approach I believe we have that's a feasible one moving forward.
The common sense is, okay, say we go with battery-powered cars and we, cut back the CO2 emissions. We're going to have to mine 5 times more mining throughout the world to get those, the lithium and everything we need to make those batteries. So we're totally running up the wrong tree. I mean, here in the United States, we have done great strides in cutting back compared to the rest of the world, but we're willing to go ahead and let the rest of the world supply us the oil and create worse CO2 emissions than anywhere. So we got to talk to somebody and do some things and make some moves.
I agree, Senator Fazy. Personally, I'm not a fan of making changes by executive fiat. I'm a believer in allowing market forces to dictate where we go moving forward. What I see worldwide is demand for low-carbon products, causing companies like CF Industries, like Grown, a lot of the larger oil and gas companies are in the process of rebranding themselves as energy companies, as opposed to exclusively oil and gas companies. That's no one telling them to do that. That's their board of directors making that decision on what's best for their company. At least a couple of the projects I mentioned earlier were, in fact, all of them were driven by companies making decisions on what's best for their bottom line. And more companies are believing that green energy is good for their bottom line, allows them to sell a product at a higher profit. Having said that, we're trying to tackle the issue that's directly in front of us, which is federal energy policy, what the federal policy is going to be regarding offshore leasing and production, and trying to make meaningful impact on that policy. And doing so, I agree, it's very urgent, and we're working on that as quickly as we can. Thank you, sir.
Representative Mincy, can your question go to the next speaker from the governor's office, or do you need to ask it here to the secretary?
Secretary Harris, thank you for all your comments and for being with us here today. When you suggest that our best opportunity to combat these executive orders is to argue our position, we've talked about this a little bit, but can you specifically tell us who's arguing for us now?
Well, I'm sure he's not the only one. There are a lot of people with an interest in this, but the gentleman that I report directly to, I know he's arguing it. He's working it every day because he's constantly calling me looking for new ammunition. You know, I don't want to send my boss into a gunfight with a knife. I'm trying to provide him with the best arguments, as are all of his staff and cabinet secretaries, to make good arguments that are hard to refute, that are defensible and backed by data. And I believe we're making progress. I'm sure this body may want to make a resolution, and the more voices that the administration hears, particularly those in a positive light, can only help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're going to bring up our next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next up, I'm going to welcome Mr. Matthew Block to the floor from the governor's office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Hinskins, members. Matthew Block for the governor's office. I'll be very brief. You've had a lot of information presented to you already this morning, and you have a number of more speakers later to follow. I think the message that you're going to hear in various different forms today from both the congressional delegation and from the state leadership, you're going to hear from Chairman Klein here in a second, all are agreeing sort of with the fundamental point that was made by Chairman Cousin at the beginning of this, which is that it is a false choice to say we can either have one or the other. We can have oil and gas exploration and environmental protections. We know in Louisiana that we can do both, and that's what the governor has advocated for his entire career, that we know that we are an energy state. We will continue to be an energy state, and that oil and gas exploration, both onshore and offshore in Louisiana, is critically important to the state's economy, for jobs, for the powering the world from Louisiana. That's one of the reasons that, and I don't want to steal Chairman Klein's thunder, because I know he's going to speak about this when he comes up, or I assume he will, which is that's why before the election last year, back in August of last year, the governor with Chip Klein established the Climate Initiatives Task Force to talk about a number of different things, but to talk about all of the issues we are talking about today, but to do it in a collaborative approach, which is working with industry, which are members of that task force, to work with environmental groups who are members of that task force, to work with community groups who are members of that task force, to talk about ways that we can have and avoid that false choice that Chairman Cousin was talking about earlier, because we can do both, and we know in Louisiana that we can have oil and gas exploration done in a way that is safe for workers, that is safe for the environment, and also ways that protects our coast. And so what the governor will do, as you heard from Secretary Harris earlier, is the governor intends to follow the science and the data and to work with you all, to work with industry, and has already been doing that. The governor had meetings with some of the very people that you're going to hear from later on in this presentation today with industry, talking about ways that Louisiana and the governor specifically can be a voice with this new administration, to work collaboratively with them to advocate on behalf of Louisiana workers, Louisiana industry, and frankly, because we know our state economy, depends so much on oil and gas, for the state of Louisiana itself to be able to make sure that we have a constructive voice in this administration so that we can work together to try and make sure that those concerns that all of you are raising, that the members raised this morning, are heard, and that all of us are following the science and the data, which is what I think the people who sent all of us, whether it's to Baton Rouge or to Washington, expect from us. And lastly, I think we do have to be cognizant. The governor does support that the many new renewable resources that are going to be out there, because what we know is the same ingenuity that allowed for Louisiana companies to build the oil and gas industry in this state and then export that knowledge and expertise around the world, because it is Louisiana companies that are doing oil and gas exploration all over the world and are teaching the world how to do it. That same ingenuity is going to allow those companies and newer companies, just like was mentioned earlier about the company in Southwest Louisiana, where we will be able to have those same companies now do additional work in renewable resources, whether it be wind or solar, whatever it may be, as an all-of-the-above approach to producing energy for the state of Louisiana and for the world. And so that's what the governor intends to do. I'll answer Chairman Henskin's question earlier. I think he asked, I was having a conversation, so I couldn't hear exactly what the question was, but I think the question was, I don't see Chairman Henskin's, but I believe he asked a question of whether or not the governor had spoken directly to the president about this. I do not believe that the governor has been able to speak directly to the president about this particular issue. As you might be aware, we have a lot of requests of this new administration right now, some of which they've been very responsive to, especially on COVID response. We've gotten a tremendous, in vaccine supply, we have gotten a very good response from this new administration for that. But obviously we have a lot of asks from this new administration. We need tremendous assistance, especially in Southwest Louisiana, on hurricane recovery, as up to the northern border with Arkansas, across the state with hurricane recovery. And we're going to be asking this administration for huge assistance there. So the governor did speak with the incoming Secretary of Energy, Governor Granholm, yesterday or day before, one of those two. Had a very good conversation talking about the same issues that we're talking about this morning. So the governor intends to be an advocate for Louisiana, an advocate for Louisiana workers, and an advocate for Louisiana industry, and lastly, an advocate for our coast, because for all the things that are critically important that we know, especially those of us that live on the coast, see every day, and that Chairman Klein spends every waking hour working on. All these issues are tied together, both for funding purposes, for the economy purposes, for job purposes. So with that, I'll conclude, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer. If not, then I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Mr. Block. Yes, we look forward to working with you throughout the session, and thank you for always being accessible to all of us. But with that, we'll have welcome to the floor Chairman Chip Klein, Coastal Restoration and Climate Task Force, as well as several other hats. So thank you, Mr. Klein, for coming to the Capitol. Members, we also have lunch that you can pick up and bring back to your desks or eat in the break room if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members. I am here today, as the chairman said, as the chairman of the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority Board and as executive assistant to the governor for coastal activities. Members, here's a fact that every person in this state should be proud of. The state of Louisiana has the largest climate adaptation plan in the entire country in our coastal master plan for a sustainable coast. It is a plan that is in large part funded with revenues that are derived from the most highly regulated, the cleanest, and the least carbon-intensive oil and gas produced anywhere in the world. Members, I'm also here today representing an agency that has an implementation record that is also the envy of the nation. Since 2007, the state's coastal program has secured over $20 billion that has implemented projects in all 20 coastal parishes. We have mobilized over 150 million cubic yards of material that have benefited over 315 miles of levees, 60 miles of barrier islands, and over 46,000 acres of new land. The truth of the matter is this, is that our successes and accomplishments in the coastal program are the result of productive working relationships with stakeholders of many stripes, including local governments, levee districts, landowners, the private sector, environmental organizations, and yes, oil and gas companies. We rely on these partnerships to provide access to land, to do restoration projects, to provide political and policy support at home and in Washington. We rely on these partnerships to help educate our citizens about the need for coastal restoration and hurricane protection. And perhaps most importantly, we rely on these partnerships for the funding that is necessary to implement coastal protection and restoration projects across South Louisiana. So today, members, my message to the Biden administration, to any future presidential administration, every member of Congress, and to state legislatures across the country. If you are looking to make climate policy that can both increase community resilience and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions while still maintaining a working coast and productive economy, then you should look no further than the state of Louisiana. The fact is, Louisiana is a leader when it comes to this issue. States from around the country, people literally from around the globe, come here to learn about how we are approaching this issue. And I would encourage those who set policy in Washington, D.C. to do the same. Here we have a balanced approach. We have a collaborative approach, an approach that brings oil and gas to the table to help develop solutions from the ground up to address the effects and causes of climate change. Here in Louisiana, the oil and gas industry works with environmental organizations and state agencies on climate policy. You just heard from Secretary Harris and Mr. Block in the governor's office about the Climate Initiatives Task Force that was stood up in 2020. A task force that has a goal in front of it of reaching net carbon neutrality by 2050. That goal is also in line with some of the main oil and gas companies that are operating here. But the approach we're taking in Louisiana is bringing oil and gas to the table in a collaborative manner, working with them on how they can capture carbon and reduce emissions. Members, the coastal program's only consistent funding that comes from the state of Louisiana on an annual basis is from oil and gas productions on state land and state water bottoms. In good years, these funds are around $25 million annually. In other years, when prices are down, they can stay between $10 to $15 million. The coastal program's only annual recurring source of revenue from the federal government comes from the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, more commonly referred to as GOMESA, which created a standing revenue sharing arrangements between the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Under GOMESA, Gulf-producing states split 37.5% of qualified OCS revenues, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund gets 12.5%. The remaining 50% of GOMESA revenues remain with the federal government, which is approximately $5 billion annually that's generated off of our coast that goes into the federal treasury. This is important. GOMESA shares two primary sources of revenue. One, bonus bids that come from new lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico. And two, royalties that come from oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico. So the recent executive orders that are coming out of the White House would directly affect future revenues under GOMESA tied to bonus bids, as they are related to new lease sales, and it could impact future revenues shared with the Gulf states from actual oil and gas production. I cannot stress enough, members, the importance of the GOMESA revenue sharing program to our program here in Louisiana. Those revenues come to the Coastal Trust Fund in one lump sum every year. We use those dollars to cash flow our entire operation. Many of you are very familiar with the funds that are coming to the coastal program as a result of the BP oil spill settlement. Those dollars are grant-based, meaning that we have to spend money out of our trust fund first and then seek reimbursement. So we have to have the cash in our trust fund available to us to float so we can actually issue those contracts, get those projects moving, and then seek reimbursement from the BP oil spill settlements. Last year's coastal annual plan that goes in front of both Senate and House Natural Resources Committee projected $389 million in GOMESA expenditures over the next 3 fiscal years. These investments will provide flood protection for these specific projects Representative Mincy, who I don't see in here, but asked about earlier. Number one, $80 million, Senator Alain, for the Bayou Chene project in St. Mary Parish that actually protects 6 parishes: St. Mary, St. Martin, Assumption, Iberville, Terrebonne, and Lafourche. $16.8 million for the Goose Bayou levee alignment in Representative Kerner's district. $9 million for St. Tammany ring levee in Senator Hewitt's district. $7 million for the West Shore Lake Pontchartrain that protects the river parishes. $9 million for 2 projects in Upper Barataria, which includes St. Charles and Lafourche. $2 million for the East Bank Sediment Transport Corridor in St. Bernard. $18.5 million for a floodgate in Lafourche Parish. $2 million for Director Chasson's beach improvement at Port Fourchon. $11.5 million for a critical pump station on Bayou Lafourche. I could go on and on. $10 million, Senator Hinchkins, for home elevations in southwest Louisiana. These aren't just conservation-type projects. These are projects that protect people, businesses, and livelihoods. And the fact is, members, is that we are working tirelessly with members of our congressional delegation on additional federal authorizations. And we have to have the money necessary here as a state to meet our cost share obligations. So Representative Mincy talked about Morganza to the Gulf, Southwest Coastal. All of these things require cost shares from the state of Louisiana to get these projects moving. I would also point out, members, that over the last few years, the policies coming out of Washington, D.C. have been inconsistent, to say the least. Just last year, the federal government saw it fit to take oil and gas revenues generated off of our coast to fund environmental and recreational use projects across the entire country. However, it's our coast that takes the brunt of those impacts. It's our coast that sustains that infrastructure, that protects that infrastructure, and it is our coast that allows that revenue to be generated to begin with. And now it seems like the policies coming out of D.C. would call into question the very funding used to fund those very projects across the country. So in closing, Mr. Chairman, Louisiana is an energy-producing state. We're a state that has a coastal program that relies heavily on the revenues generated from oil and gas production to restore and protect our coast. But we're also a state that is on the front lines of a climate crisis. Here in this state, we have a plan that addresses the effects of climate change. We are developing a plan of action that will address the causes of climate change collaboratively with all stakeholder groups. And this state, through its coastal program, will continue to work with oil and gas industry on policies that ensure the overall sustainability and to ensure that we continue a productive working relationship that aims to restore our coast, protect our citizens, and preserve this place we call home. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I couldn't agree with you more on many of your points. And I do believe that CPRA happens to be one of the most dynamic agencies in all of state government, and its deliverables are second to none. So we appreciate that work that you're doing for our state and our coast and the entire United States. We do have a question from Representative Ogeron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Klein. Reiterate what Chairman Couson said, being from representing Lower Lafourche, you know how important CPRA master plan is to me all 50 years going forward. Being involved in coastal resiliency, the one question I think needs to be asked here is what percentage of CPRA's annual budget is derived from oil and gas?
So Representative Ogeron, as I mentioned, the only recurring sources of revenue from state and federal government come from oil and gas revenue. So if you look back over the last several years, and I want to be careful here, Representative Ogeron, because as I mentioned, all of you are familiar with the funding that comes to the coastal program as a result of the BP oil spill settlement. So I want to set those aside because those are coming to the state as a result of a terrible disaster that did extensive damage to our coastal wetlands. However, if you take into account just Go Mesa and state mineral revenues, in fiscal year 19 through 20, oil and gas accounted for about 27.83%. In fiscal year 18 through 19, 39%. And then fiscal year 17 through 18, about 54% of our revenues. And you're going to get me, I know we're short on time here, but Representative Ogeron, I think it's very important if you look into the future, BP oil spill dollars are only coming to the coastal program over 15 years. If Go Mesa goes away and BP goes away, you're essentially left with a coastal program that has about $40 million annually to fund a $50 billion coastal master plan. If you would take into account, and again, I want to be careful here, but we get asked this question a lot, if you take into account the funds that are coming into the coastal program from BP and state mineral and Go Mesa revenues, you're looking at upwards of 85% of the funds that are coming to the coastal program are derived from oil and gas.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Kerner, it looks like it's our last question for you, Chairman Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Klein. And let me just say, I think you have the most important job in the state of Louisiana. And I appreciate all the speakers here today, but I will tell you that two stood out to me, and it shows in your heart and your work the wonderful love you have for the state of Louisiana. That's you and Congressman Graves. And I don't want to belittle anybody else. They did a good job, but truly, it shows the hard work that you two guys put into the coast of Louisiana. Now, I'll tell you, from a coastal community, I'm scared. From a representative from a coastal community, I'm scared for not only for my area, but for Cameron all the way to Slidell. Last year, you started this program of lobbying Congress to let them know how important it was for Go Mesa and to get a few extra funds from the Go Mesa. So I'm asking you, I thought that was a great thing that you spearheaded and you did, but I think it needs to, with the new administration and the negative things they're doing to oil and gas, I think you need to really multiply that and do a full court press and lobby Washington and let them know how important this is.
Yes, sir. We are absolutely going to continue that push with the new Congress and the new presidential administration. I would just throw one statistic out to the members here. Representative Kerner mentioned Go Mesa. There is a great disparity that exists between coastal producing states that share in oil and gas revenues in federal waters compared to inland producing states that share on revenues from oil and gas produced on federal lands. So for example, as you heard Congressman Graves say, the state of Louisiana got a check last year from the neighborhood of about $160 million. By comparison, the state of New Mexico got a check for $1.1 billion. New Mexico can use those dollars for whatever they want. plug budget holes, economic development projects here in Louisiana and across the Gulf, we have to spend those dollars on coastal restoration and hurricane protection. So $1.1 billion on federal lands compared to $160 million in federal waters. And it's our coast, again, that is sustaining that infrastructure that allows that revenue to be generated, is I think, a policy that needs to be addressed at the federal level. And we'll continue that push working with you, Representative Kerner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Kerner. Thanks, Chairman Klein. We appreciate you coming to the Capitol today. And I know this is not the last time that you'll be talking to the members. We'll all have an opportunity at our respective committees to do that during session. I'd like to welcome to the floor next our two representatives from the Louisiana Attorney General's Office. We have Liz Morell and Bill Lafayette Stiles. Welcome to the floor. And as they're making their way, can I get our three parish presidents to make your way to the corner down here by the break room, and I'll have you sitting in the chairs, and I'll tee you up after their presentation in the order that we have you listed. Ms. Morell, the floor is yours.
We distributed the paper. I'm trying to give him a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that we distributed to you to see if we can get it up on your screens. If you give me 1 second. Thank you. It's a little bit awkward. Mr. Chairman, both chairmans, thank you for having us here today. And we distributed a PowerPoint presentation that has just some high points that, and I'll kind of walk through that. If you haven't read the two executive orders that were issued, one on January 20th and one on January 27th, I would urge you to do that. They are very frightening documents to me and to us. I would, okay, so which one's the right? That one's in. So, and just to give you some of the high points on the January 20th order, that's the order that suspended the Keystone Pipeline permit and terminated several other Trump executive orders that allowed exploration and some other federal lands and it also directs a comprehensive review of a number of final rules, including the new 401 permitting rules and the ACE rule that replaced the Obama-era Clean Power Plan rules. It creates a working group to develop and immediately issue damages values for the social cost of carbon, the social cost of methane, and the social cost of nitrous oxide. This is a way to monetize global climate damages. The directive in the order is that within 30 days of the order, which was issued January 20th, this working group will issue new numbers that shall be applied, and it's pretty vague by whom and to whom, but we know from some litigation in the past that it'll probably be applied immediately in NEPA to environmental impact studies. That's a global damages number, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes about, as a practical matter, what that means in terms of the cost of projects and how ginormous those numbers can become with a multiplier of that. And I know that Dr. David Dismukes is going to be testifying in a little while, and I think he can also speak as an economist about what it means to come up with these values and how they will be applied. They will be applied across agencies. It's a very broad definition intended to capture global social costs of carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide. The first numbers are directed to be issued February 20th. with additional deadlines later in 2021 and 2022 for expanding the use of those values and updating them, in other words, increasing them. They will have an immediate impact on permits, rule reviews, and NEPA studies, among other things. The executive order of January 27th, which is titled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, it pauses new oil and natural gas leases on public lands and offshore waters pending another comprehensive review and reconsideration of permitting and leasing practices in light of, quote, broad stewardship responsibilities over public lands and offshore waters and potential climate and other impacts. This is a directive that will have an enormous impact on everything we're doing. Considering whether to adjust royalties or take other appropriate action to account for the corresponding climate costs. Again, back to those social costs of carbon numbers, those numbers will be applied. Identify and eliminate federal subsidies of fossil fuels. I think the idea of a subsidy they view to be very broad. It will be anything, any kind of tax incentive. There's another aspect of these orders that I think should give you some great concerns, and that is that they direct the Secretary of the Treasury to target international financing of the fossil fuel industry. So how that will play out across international and domestic financial policy, we have yet to see, but I mean, it is a very concerning directive. We are monitoring for agency actions that result from these orders. We've already, I think the order already, especially the January 20th order relative to the social cost of carbon, methane, and nitrous is a directive. It is an actual order. It says come up with these numbers, issue them in 30 days, and they shall be applied across agencies. So I think that is a very definitive action that is going to have a material impact on us. But we're also monitoring for other agency action. And one of those is the Interior Order 3395. The Secretary of the Interior issued that order on January 20th, the same day as the first executive order, and it was a temporary suspension of delegated authority. And I know you heard some testimony earlier about, about permits and things that we have pending and applications that we may have pending. Well, you can amplify that for anybody, any private company or coalition of companies that's actually drilling in the Gulf or seeking permits for leases that may have been issued in prior lease sales. All of those, there are a lot of day-to-day types of decision-making and ordinary things that BSEE and BOEM have to engage in. All of that has been channeled to headquarters. And we've been collecting information, but the general understanding at this point is that about 9 people are going to be right now authorized to make decisions at the headquarters level. And that means thousands, that will be a backlog of thousands of decisions that simply can't be made because there's only 9 people who are actually authorized to make those decisions. So the retraction of the delegation of authority is an enormously important action. It suspends the delegation of authority to department bureaus and offices, including any action requiring Federal Register notice, actions under NEPA, in fact, which includes those environmental impact studies, issues arising under the resource management plans, conveyance of rights of way, easements, notices to proceed. That's just a small sampling. It will touch amendments, extensions, and permits to drill. These orders do not purport to limit existing operations on valid leases, but they impact a whole myriad of decision-making that affect on the ability to actually carry out operations under those existing leases. Because everything is impacted and only 9 people in the Department of the Interior will actually have the ability to make any decisions. BOEM issued a record of decision on January 21st. That has legal significance that it's a record of decision. They published an ROD stating that the Gulf of Mexico lease sale 257 will go forward on March 17th, but recent comments have already indicated that that is under further review and it may not take place at all. OSLA authorizes BOEM to propose a plan for leasing every 5 years. The current plan only goes through 2022. No new plan has been proposed. And so if they take no action, we will have no plan. And BOEM and DOI have not offered any guidance about the development of a new 5-year plan. So that's another effective way of simply stopping the development and the issuance of leases, which are mandated under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, but basically by inaction will just not happen. NEPA and BOEM guidelines dictate permitting and plan approvals. Usually the environmental impact analysis is limited to local issues and effects, but if you go back and look at that section 5 of the January 20th order, it changes the policy to a social cost of carbon that is global in nature, not local in nature, which means the numbers are going to be amplified. There's also a Department of Justice agency memo that has been also issued, and it retracts guidance that was in effect in the Department of Justice that affected the way settlement money was used, affects the ability to how reviews were done when money was being channeled to third parties. All of that guidance has been retracted. That will affect settlements and litigation. Some of the materials that we've been reviewing specifically identify 4 different scenarios and the outcomes of these policies. The first, least restrictive one, would be no new exploration leases from 2021, but exploration continues in the blocks that are already leased. The result of that is curtailed exploration, which obviously, as you just heard from Mr. Klein, that's going to have a dramatic effect on us and our ability to fund our coastal master plan. No new drilling from 2021, no new exploration drilling from 21, but existing discoveries can move ahead. That would put us on a declining path that's going to, again, continue to affect our revenues and our ability to fund the master plan. No new drilling, no exploration, appraisal, or development drilling, but production from existing wells allowed would be a rapid terminal decline, which would put us basically into a death spiral. And then production shutdown on federal lands and waters from 2022 would just be a death blow to the Gulf of Mexico. So we are trying to collect information on the most immediate impacts that are occurring here and the delays in permitting. All the decision making at this point appears to have ground to a halt. All approvals have been shifted to headquarters. The denials or delays in permitting and plan approvals will include those that involve the Corps and in anything that we have to submit to BOEM or BSEE or EPA. 37, I'm aware of 37 exploration and development plans that were submitted to BOEM, by BOEM to headquarters shortly after the order came out, and those are just waiting on approvals. Again, we have no idea how long it will take because they have shifted the approval process to 9 individuals who may or may not be confirmed yet. They have to be confirmed. So what we see now would be direct and indirect impacts to businesses large and small. And I would also refer you to a report that was issued by Dr. Lauren Scott in 2018, and he updated a study that had been initially done for the Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association in 1996, and it was updated in 2002, 2007, 2010, and 2014, and he updated it in 2018, and it studies the energy sector. Its title is The Energy Sector, a giant economic engine for the Louisiana economy. And it really breaks down into great detail the interconnectivity of our relationship with the oil and gas industry and the revenues that it produces and the jobs that it sustains in our communities And so if you're looking to see what the impacts will be, that study is, I think, enormously helpful because it identifies for you fairly recently how much of our economy is based upon and dependent on this economy. The other thing, and I think that we haven't really talked a lot about this today, but the collapse of the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund, that is a federal fund that's funded by OCS revenues through lease bids and oil revenue. The estimates I have are that the fund would go from $1.3 billion a year to less than $300 million a year in a single year. And that is also money that funds projects not only in our state but in other states. So if you want to see the recipe for how to kill this industry, it's laid out for you in those executive orders. Pause everything, suspend current rules, delay them, and issue new rules that take into account the global cost, social cost of carbon in a way that essentially makes it financially impossible to get anything approved or funded, and then attack the financing mechanisms globally for the industry. It's really going to be a huge problem, and I think that we are obviously looking at all the mechanisms that we have at our disposal to address this. That will include comment letters where that's appropriate, where there are rules that are being proposed to suspend or delay existing rules. We can comment on those rules, and as that works its way through the process, we can ultimately challenge those rules. We can challenge now, we can challenge the implementation of these orders, and we can challenge them to the extent that they conflict with the Outer Continental Land Shelf Act. Bill Stiles is going to talk a little bit about some of the other social and potential impacts of these policies.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, members. Our Solicitor General did a great job here kind of getting into the weeds because we've talked a lot today about the suspension of permitting in the Outer Continental Shelf and in the Gulf and the immediate impact that has. But there's so much more to these executive orders because the devil's in the details. When she's talking about the social cost of carbon, that is going to have to be calculated now for every permit. I look at my parish presidents here. I've worked when we were in Congress with Gordy Dove quite often on issues he was dealing with core permitting in his parishes when he was trying to get the beginnings of what has become a very successful levee building project down in his parishes. He could tell you Corps of Engineer permitting processes are very expensive. When you start adding deeper regulations to those processes, you adding cost. And how does that translate? So now we have a $50 billion coastal restoration program, right? Or that was our expectation 5 or 10 years ago. We may see that potentially double or go up by a factor of a quarter or half over the next 5 years, because as these projects come along, permitting and mitigating costs are some of the most expensive costs associated with any governmental project. We're talking about the oil and gas industry and this impact it's going to have on the oil and gas industry. I see some of our friends up in the gallery here who will probably be speaking later today. Certainly this is going to have the potential for a devastating impact on our oil and gas industry. But let's talk about some other things that this is going to impact. What about development for housing, where we go and have to clear property and have to get, again, core permitting to do such a thing? What happens to our infrastructure when the price of, I know this has been talked about in these halls for quite some time, raising the taxes on gasoline. Who's going to have the stomach to raise the taxes on gasoline when the price may be $3 or $4 a gallon in the next few years? We have on this slide here the Yellow Vest movement. That occurred in France, and quite frankly, now it's kind of widespread throughout Europe. A lot of people may have seen that on TV and wondered, what is that about? Well, when France and the rest of the European Union got involved with the Paris Accord, which is their Green New Deal, in essence, the one that we've just reinserted ourselves into, the cost of fuel and energy to the transportation sectors in Europe rose so dramatically, it in essence created civil rioting, on the streets of Paris and everywhere else by people who are protesting the exorbitant cost of fuel that was affecting their jobs. And I know there's some folks who don't have constituents that live in the coastal area of Louisiana. Maybe they don't have constituents that are involved in the oil and gas industry. But guess what? The cost of every product at Walmart is going up, because you can't get a product in Walmart without bringing it from somewhere. And the cost of diesel and transportation costs translate into higher costs everywhere, not only at the gas pump, at Walmart, pizza delivery. Everything we do is going to cost more. Congressman Graves did a great job at talking about the cost of electricity and utilities in California. What happens to our constituents when we have no jobs left in our state, and we turn around and tell them, but guess what? The cost of your gas is going up, the cost of utilities is going up, the cost of food is going up, all because of some extraordinarily ill-advised policies. And Secretary Harris is not here anymore, but he mentioned something. He's not a big fan of executive fiat. Well, you know what? The Attorney General isn't either. And I totally appreciate the fact that the governor has a relationship with this administration. I think he's the only governor in the South that probably was actually for Mr. Biden as president. And certainly Mr. Biden is our president, and we're going to have to go and work with him. And I appreciate that they're going to try to use that relationship to move this thing along. But while that's going on, these regulations are going to be tearing our industries apart. And I can tell you a commitment from the Attorney General's office is that we intend to litigate, and where we can go fight these regulatory processes, because executive fiat is not how you run a country. We don't change the entire energy landscape of a nation by executive fiat. This is public policy decisions. And so in cases where we can, we will litigate. We'll join with partners from other states that will litigate, because we can't sit around while we're negotiating and having conversations while our state and our economy is on fire. You know, quite frankly, and I think Congressman Higgins kind of hit on this, if we were sitting around, you know, if this was a James Bond spy thriller, and we were sitting at the boardroom of Spectre, and we're going to decide how to bring the United States to its knees. How can you get the economic security of the United States down, and how can you get the national security of the United States in trouble? We'd probably come up with this plan, because that's what this is going to do. This destroys the economic security of the United States of America, because it's going to move us from our own energy. We've been fighting for 50 years to become energy independent. We're finally there. Now we're going to go back the other direction. Economically, it's crippling. What about for our national security? What happens now when all these foreign governments they're going to produce energy in other countries. We're going to be exporting oil, because everybody knows we have to have it despite what they tell us. What happens to our national security? Are we going to get back into, every time there's a tanker gets abducted or hostage by the Iranians, that the price of oil spikes? You notice that had happened in the last 4 years, 5 years, right? It's because we become energy independent. So, you know, this is a terrible plan. We intend to fight tooth and nail every way we can, and what we're going to need is a commitment, and I hope a commitment from both sides of the aisle, and I hope a commitment from the governor and Secretary Harris, who doesn't appreciate executive fiat. I hope we get a commitment of you guys to support us and make sure that we have the resources to bear to bring these cases forward, to litigate these actions, to protect the people of Louisiana and your constituents. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stiles. And if this is Spectre, then maybe you're Austin Powers, and I'm Austin Powers Faja. So that'll be perfect. Next, I'd like to bring up 3 parish presidents whose economies are fundamentally shaped by the oil and gas industry. First up, I'd like to welcome Archie Chasson to come and speak from Lafourche Parish. Welcome to the House, Mr. Parish President.
Thank you, Chairman Couson. Thank you, Chairman Hinchkins, members, Archie Chesson, Lafourche Parish President, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today to speak on behalf of the 100,000 Lafourche residents, a majority of who wake up every day and put on their hard hats and their coveralls and their work boots and go to work in the oil and gas industry. So I want to start by saying I don't think anybody in the room, whether it was full or not, would argue that climate change is not real and something that we need to have a conversation about. And a lot has already been said about emission standards and how these executive orders actually do more harm to the global economy and the global climate than they do good. That's why the overall assault on an industry that actually feeds and fuels our nation is a slap in the face to every American and every Louisianian. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of what's been said about the emission requirements, but I will point out a couple of things. That if we're going to talk about energy alternatives, there's a few things that we need to remember. That those Tesla cars that people drive need to be plugged in at the end of the day. And what powers them? Diesel electric generators. The batteries that are inside under those hoods come from Mexico, from lithium that's mined. And it's being mined by using 5 megawatt gensets powered by LNG. And the windmills that are going up all over the East Coast have to be lubricated to continue to run. And you can't do that with sunflower seed oil. It's got to be a petroleum product. And by the way, the lift boats that came from Cutoff to work on those wind farms run on diesel electric generators and engines. And Lafourche is the home to Port Fourchon. I'm proud that we have some commissioners, and I'm not going to steal Executive Director Chesson's thunder because I know he'll be up in a minute. But it is the economic driver for Lafourche Parish and something that feeds and fuels our nation and contributes millions to the state's economy and billions to the national coffers. And while revenue loss is a concern for us, and I'll talk about that in a second, it's about taking care of our people first. Because without them, the revenue goes away anyway. Just to give you a glimpse at what our industry means to the Bayou region, and we pulled these numbers from the Workforce Commission, the major sectors in Lafourche, 5,600 people in exploration and production, 4,100 in oil field service companies, and another 4,100 people in shipbuilding and maritime. And that's just a small sector of the group. It's the threats to these families and the thousands like them that have kept me up the last few weeks since President Biden set this stuff into motion. And any job lost is unacceptable. So now let's talk about the revenue piece. And while we're still digging through the data, we've come up with an initial figure of about 15% of a revenue reduction a year should this go beyond just a 60-day moratorium. And we came up with that by looking at the number of boats that we anticipate would leave, the offshore vessels in Lafourche. Unfortunately, we tax offshore vessels like we do your house. So for every one boat that leaves Port Fourchon, I need 200 homes to make up that taxing difference, which is huge. And that 15% reduction does not take into account and is not inclusive of the coastal revenue through GOMESA that we use for coastal restoration and other infrastructure projects, as well as the QIPR dollars that come to our parish for coastal restoration. That 15% equates to about $15 million a year to the parish's bottom line, and is also not inclusive of the impacts to our schools, law enforcement, fire service, and emergency medical services. That number extrapolated over and over again as it spreads to other parishes in the state as a whole. And it's not just the sheer reduction of revenue based on the offshore vessels in the port, it's the trickle-down effect. It's the hardware stores, it's our local businesses, it's the safety stores, it's the gas stations. That second part of the number is the scariest one, is that trickle-down economics continues to happen, and the impacts to those businesses are far worse than some of the majors. And again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and appreciate your commitment, Senator Hinchkins' commitment, and the committee's commitment to be on the forefront of these issues and your commitment to local government as we work to fight this. And as excited as I am, and I'm going to take a personal privilege moment if you don't mind, Chairman Couson, as excited as I am to have Representative Ogeron in the room, one of my best friends, Reggie Bagala, got to stand behind this podium. And for me, it's a very proud and emotional moment to stand here as his parish president, to lead the charge and to help fight with all of you to continue to protect the hardworking men and women of Louisiana. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, and his legacy does live on, and we remember him fondly. Thank you for mentioning that. Up next, I'll introduce former chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee and current parish president of Terrebonne, Gordy Dove. Welcome back to the chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, and I want to thank y'all for putting on this committee meeting. I mean, what's going on right now in Washington will definitely be devastating to Terrebonne Parish, the state of Louisiana, and many other parishes. Terrebonne Parish is about 60% dependent indirectly and directly on oil and gas. A lot of our revenues that reach Terrebonne Parish, of course, come from Fouchon offshore and off the shelf. You know, Terrebonne people have taxed themselves for their own protection, and we've done it. We are reaching close to $1 billion in infrastructure on levees, floodgates, and lock systems. You know, thanks to the state of Louisiana and the people of Terrebonne taxing themselves. We have not gotten any federal money till here lately. We were awarded $12.4 million with the federal government through the START through the START language in the final bill in Congress. And I want to thank the delegation. Our federal delegation has done a wonderful job. Terrebonne Parish, it has numerous service companies, machine shops, shipyards, fabrication companies, labor companies, supply houses. We now have the largest heliport in the United States. And helicopters are considered takeoff and landing by FAA, and of course that's more federal monies. You know, in the direction that Washington, that this new administration is taking us, you know, President Biden has led the energy industry into peril because we are going to be dependent on foreign oil like we were before, back when the United States only produced about 4 million barrels a day, and as of now we're doing 10 or 11 million barrels per day. So it's so important that these policies are changed. You know, and I want to thank the delegation again, a lot of them who talked here today, who spoke, that there is, you know, that they're all going to try to get with the Biden administration, and I hope President Biden changes his mind and understands that we are, I must say it again, the energy independence is in peril with these new policies, and you know, it has to be changed. The people of Terrebonne, the people of Louisiana, Texas, and many other states are so dependent on it, and you know, this talk of going with electric cars, we have pushed natural gas cars as long as I was been here in Baton Rouge. We've pushed, and that's as clean as energy as you can get. There's no talk in Washington about operating cars and vehicles on natural gas anymore. It's all electric. And the attack on the oil industry is unwarranted, and it's a handful of environmentalists that don't understand anything except to do away with oil and gas, and it's really a shame. And I hope the Biden administration does change their policy, and hopefully Congress can help them change that policy, because we're going on a path that the people of Louisiana better realize, and a lot of them do, that oil and gas is Louisiana, and without it, our tax base will be devastating. If you legislators right now, I've watched y'all deal with some tough budgets. Y'all have done a wonderful job balancing them. But with the oil and gas industry out of the equation, it's going to be the worst deficits that we've ever seen in the state of Louisiana. So thank each and every one of you for putting it on. Thank everyone involved with this, and hopefully the Biden administration will come to reality and see that they cannot go down this path of killing energy independence and driving the price of oil up to $100 a barrel. And people are going to start realizing it when they're going to pull up to fill up their cars. So, Mr. Chairman, I think everything else has been said here. You know, along with the Go Mesa, as important as Go Mesa is, that it will be heard on our coastal restoration, hurricane protection. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
Thank you, President Dove. Next, I'd like to welcome the Mayor-President of Lafayette, my mayor from my district, Josh Guillory. Mayor-President, welcome to the House floor.
Good afternoon to everyone. Chairman Hinskins, one of my senators, Chairman Couson, one of our representatives in Lafayette Parish, to the Senate and House joint committee members, and also to my fellow parish presidents. It truly is an honor to be here, and I thank you for this opportunity to share my concerns with you regarding the incoming administration's moratorium on new permits for offshore energy exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. What strikes me first is that President Biden's moratorium is not a standalone action. It's a part of a wide-ranging executive order on the federal response to what is referred to as the climate crisis. The order is breathtaking in its scope, reach, but also its ultimate impact, and I know that as a parish president, where the rubber meets the road, and my fellow parish presidents know that as well. President Biden's executive order contains numerous provisions that span the entirety of the federal government and involve virtually every agency and department. Broadly speaking, the order appears to be directed squarely at energy exploration. It includes plans to develop targets for the elimination of fossil fuels across nearly all industries. It's nothing less than a comprehensive, broad-based federal attack on the fossil fuels industry. Now, focusing on the moratorium specifically, a broad spectrum of market analysts hold the view that this moratorium creates significant long-term risks for the United States supply. It is the Gulf of Mexico, the Rocky Mountains, and Alaska operators who will bear the brunt of President Biden's plans, while the administration's carbon strategy is being formulated and implemented. See, for 70 years, oil and gas has been an integral part of the economy of Lafayette Parish. Historically, our parish has enjoyed the highest oil and gas industry employment per capita in the state of Louisiana. Energy has been our principal economic driver for generations until very recently. In the summer of 2014, when oil was over $100 per barrel, the Lafayette MSA reported 23,400 jobs in oil and gas. By January 2017, after seeing oil prices fall below $30 a barrel, we were down to 13,700 jobs, which is a loss of nearly 10,000. By March 2020, last year, pre-COVID, we were down to 12,300. And for the most recent period reported, December 2020, we are now at 9,900 jobs in the Lafayette MSA. This means a loss of 14,500 jobs in just over 5 years, a decline of 58%. That has been devastating to our local economy. As we are all aware, the Gulf of Mexico offshore rig count is in a long-term decline. In January of 2000, there were 123 operating rigs in federal waters. By January 2010, just 10 years later, that number had declined to 41. In January 2020, there were 20 rigs in service. And a year later, in January of 2021, we're looking at 16. The combination of expanded regulatory constraints and market forces resulting in low prices have led to a 90% collapse in offshore activity in 20 years. In 2014, oil and gas accounted for 10.6% of all jobs in our parish MSA. And today, we're looking at 6.5% of employment. Taken together with the administration's broad moves against the fossil fuels industry, the moratorium creates a bad long-term signal that is likely to increase uncertainty and strongly discourage investment, eventually leading to significant production shortfalls. A moratorium creates long-term uncertainty without a doubt, but it creates uncertainty with respect to the scope and to the pace of federal regulatory actions going forward. Simply, it makes our efforts to jumpstart the sector and bring back oil and gas jobs that much more difficult, not only at the local level, but at the state level as well. Another related concern is that a moratorium at this time isn't necessary. We don't need it right now. Since the administration is just taking office and their climate response plans are still being formulated, there's nothing that requires a moratorium in order to conduct a review of the permitting process. If anything, the currently issued permits are sufficient to enable activity for a year or two, and leasing activity has been on the decline. There was no real prospect of a whole bunch of new permits being issued in the first place, and this essentially means that there was no need to issue a moratorium banning new permits as a part of this executive order. This action tells markets that the investment outlook is dark and that the federal actions will be very hard to predict. Our parish, Lafayette, along with other parishes, but our parish, as the chairman said, serves as a hub. We're a hub for service companies in the energy sector, and we have been particularly hard hit by the weakness in energy prices over the past 5 years. The global drop in energy demand due to the economic shutdowns as a result of COVID-19 have compounded an already serious situation. But this moratorium and statement of broad anti-oil and gas federal policy has to be the final straw. I think most people who look at the evolution of technology in the energy sector agree that eventually we will turn to alternatives for transportation, for power generation, and for other purposes. But there is a race between the growth of federal regulations limiting the oil and gas sector and technological innovation in alternative energy sources such as photovoltaic, solar, and wind generation. There's a gap. The problem is that the current federal administration is trying to dismantle our current energy economy well before alternative technologies are ready for any transition. In the medium and long term, innovation in alternative energy sources means ongoing improvement in efficiency and cost. But preemptively crippling the sources of energy that currently drive the U.S. and global economy is foolish and wrong-headed. Not only that, it's very dangerous. In addition to causing substantial job loss across our country, this federal administration's energy policies will reverse the gains of the last 4 years, which was alluded to earlier today, that have led to the United States being energy self-sufficient for the first time in 50 years. This means we will resume reliance on sources of energy from other parts of the world that are not particularly stable or secure, or who are not necessarily our friends. Overregulation of oil and gas will cripple local and regional economies, as well as the U.S. economy, hurting American economic competitiveness. You know, for all of their rhetoric on climate change, our strategic rivals in China and Russia remain committed to fossil fuels and continue to increase their carbon emissions. Ironically, one of our speakers earlier said this. Statistics over the last few years demonstrate that it is the United States, with a combination of innovation and also market forces, that is actually reducing its carbon output. As we address all of the issues and concerns raised by the Biden administration's moratorium on new permits for offshore exploration, I respectfully suggest that we may also want to consider crafting a more comprehensive response to the implication of the administration's attacks on this very vital industry to our country, to our state, and to the parish of Lafayette and other parishes. At the heart of that response is stressing the continuing importance of oil and gas in powering our economy and the devastating impact of crippling that industry in the period before we are ready to transition to other alternatives. In many ways, timing is critical, both in life, in business, and in your jobs as legislators. Doing things in the wrong order and at the wrong time can be just as damaging as not doing them at all. Again, most reasonable people agree that our economy will eventually transition to alternatives in power generation, transportation, and other sectors. But we just can't dismantle our current energy economy before those alternatives are ready for prime time. I look forward to working with our congressional delegation, our legislative leadership, who I'm very grateful for, and all of our Louisiana stakeholders to make our voice heard. This is a critical time. It's critical. And it is incumbent upon us to stand up to the administration's reckless, counterproductive actions. I really do thank you for this opportunity, both chairpersons. I value every time I come to this very hallowed building, as a local leader, all of your decisions, and I know we're talking about a federal action, but it never leaves my mind that your jobs and what you do, it affects my people directly, and it affects other parish presidents, their people's lives. So what you do is very honorable, and I appreciate what you're doing, but thank you for hosting this event. I ask for God's blessing on our country, the state of Louisiana, and each of you and your families. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, President, and likewise, we thank you for what you're doing at the local level, especially in Lafayette, to continue building our economy. Next, I'd like to bring up Tyler Gray with the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. Mr. Gray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing us to host the meeting in here and for me the opportunity to be here at the well. So thank you very much for that. I'm looking forward to it. So first off, my name is Tyler Gray. I'm the President and General Counsel for the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. And since 1923, our association has represented all sectors of the energy industry in Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. And I definitely want to say a special thank you to all of the elected officials who've spent time today, who've held this hearing, called this hearing, to talk about this incredibly important issue. Louisiana's oil and natural gas industry has a long history of driving the economies of the Gulf Coast and providing energy security for America. There is not a parish in our state that does not benefit in some way from the impacts of industry. Banning energy development on federal lands and waters will stifle Louisiana's economic growth, threaten thousands of high-paying jobs, and undermine our environmental progress. These actions will have devastating impacts on the livelihoods of thousands of Louisiana families and on the communities that depend on our tax revenues for critical operating revenues for local governments, schools, and other essential services. While the administration's actions claim to only impact new leases, the order itself interferes with the normal course of business, the approval process, and permitting for current development plans. So we are seeing that effect amongst our members. More concerning, this appears to be a first step toward a policy that would ban natural gas and oil development on federal lands and waters altogether. Restricting offshore development would have an overwhelming consequences for America's largest energy corridor. According to an economic analysis from the American Petroleum Institute, here's a glimpse of what's at stake for Gulf Coast communities without development on federal lands. More than $223 million in revenue for the Gulf states is at risk, including $95 million for Louisiana. More than 200,000 jobs in the Gulf Coast region, more than 48,000 of those jobs are here in Louisiana. They could be lost among the nearly 1 million American jobs projected to be lost by 2022. Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi could lose more than $22 million in funding from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. There are those who say there will be emissions benefit from banning oil and gas development. This would not deliver the promised reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. Eliminating emissions directly associated with federal energy development would amount to carbon dioxide savings of less than 0.1%. In fact, a 2016 Obama-Biden administration report found that carbon dioxide emissions from production in the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf are less per barrel of oil than overseas production, which would necessarily increase after banning U.S. offshore development. In fact, a barrel of oil produced in the Gulf of Mexico has the second lowest carbon intensity in the whole world, right? The impact of the natural gas and oil industry on Louisiana's economy has a ripple effect that goes beyond just the companies operating, including indirect and service jobs, especially in the coastal communities that support operations offshore. Our local communities depend on energy production not only for economic stability, but also for the protection and resiliency of our coast. Revenues from oil and gas activity in the Gulf of Mexico are a primary funding source for critical coastal restoration and hurricane protection projects that help make our communities safer and stronger. The Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, or as we've heard about today, GOMESA, allows Gulf states to share in offshore revenue generated from oil production. To date, GOMESA has allowed more than $300 million to flow to states primarily for coastal restoration and hurricane protection. As we heard Chairman Klein say earlier today, a large percentage of their budget annually is a direct result of those revenues. And on average, it's 34% of the state's Coastal Protection Office budget is funded through mineral revenues. These funds are invested in projects that better our communities, our coast, and our culture. Limiting energy development will damage the economy and jobs and will also undermine a decade of environmental progress. The natural gas and oil industry continues to prioritize reducing environmental impacts while producing enough energy to transition away from dependence on less reliable foreign energy sources. As a result of our industry's long-standing commitment to the environment and billions of dollars worth of investment in infrastructure and technology, total emissions have fallen dramatically while production has significantly increased. In addition, CO2 emissions from the energy use across the entire economy are at their lowest level in 25 years. In terms of recent improvements to reduce emissions, the industry itself has invested $108.2 billion in greenhouse gas mitigating technologies. During the same time period, the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions by 12%, while the rest of the world has increased their CO2 emissions by 29%, with a 67% decline in emissions relative to production from 2000 to 2018. As you know, Louisiana is a large producer of natural gas. Production grew by 50% from 1990 to 2017. At the same time, methane emissions dropped by 14% during the exploration, production, and distribution of this energy source. In a recent development, the U.S. refining industry investments now enable production of lower sulfur fuel that powers ships around the world while reducing sulfur oxide emissions by 85%. According to Consumer Energy Alliance in Louisiana emissions analysis, Louisiana emissions declined by 71% across the state since 1990. This sharp decrease is remarkable given that Louisiana's gross domestic product surged 177% over the same time period. During the time, the population grew by 10% and Louisianans traveled 17% more, as measured by vehicle miles per capita. All three of these usually are accompanied by emission increases, not decreases. From 1990, Louisiana's emissions of key pollutants have decreased across the board: 71% reduction in sulfur dioxide, 66% reduction in nitrogen oxides, 49% reduction in carbon monoxide, and then 17% reduction in volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These numbers are noteworthy given that Louisiana's total and per energy capita consumption is among the top 3 states in the nation, and more than 88% of the state's energy needs are met by oil and natural gas. The idea that we must choose between energy and the environment is fundamentally flawed. In Louisiana, we know we don't have to choose. Emissions reductions and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. Industry has a proven track record of improving environmental performance during times of growth and investment. LaMoga is working with the diverse members of the Governor's Climate Task Force to develop science-based, verified solutions to continue to drive down carbon emissions in the state. Louisiana's oil and natural gas industry is leading the way to reduce and manage carbon issues as companies around the globe work to minimize their carbon footprint. Our industry has invested billions in greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, including end-use technology like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Industry's ability to innovate and develop new technologies is the key to our energy future, and technology like CCUS will play an essential role in meeting the emission reduction goals being set around the world. With CCUS technology, carbon emissions from industry operations are captured and recycled for use, and enhanced oil recovery options, EOR, are permanently stored safely underground. Because of our state's geology and existing infrastructure, Louisiana is uniquely positioned to be a key player in the carbon capture, and we have a tremendous opportunity to be a global leader in climate solutions, meeting energy demands while also protecting our environment. Now more than ever, we need sound, science-based policies that support collaborative, innovative solutions to address climate change while also promoting economic growth, domestic energy development for safe delivery of affordable, reliable energy for all. Louisiana's energy industry is committed to real solutions to climate change that build on America's energy leadership and protect the good-paying jobs for industry supports throughout our entire state. And in closing, I would like to comment that LaMoga is here as a resource as policy issues continue to be part of the debate and exactly what is going on with the orders that have been issued. Hearing the debate earlier about the way that it's affected operations, you have a secretarial order that came from the Department of Interior. You have an executive order that came from the president himself. How do those affect oil and gas operations? We are working diligently with the regulators at the Department of Interior, BOEM, and Bessie about getting clarity on those issues. In fact, I have a list here of a document where we have identified an entire page where there's lack of clarity on those issues. This is something that we continue to seek to be for all of you as a resource and collaborating with our elected officials and making sure that we can help facilitate a collaborative effort to move us and our state forward in a way that's environmentally sound, safe, keeps jobs here, and produce energy domestically instead of from foreign sources. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. There are no questions. I'm sure we may have some for you in the regular session, and we look forward to seeing you back at our committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The next few speakers are going to be Lori LeBlanc, Chet Chasson, Paul Danos, and Ben Marlborough. First up, we'll have Lori LeBlanc from the Gulf Economic Survival Team. Ms. LeBlanc, welcome to the House floor. And if you're making your way from upstairs and I'm mentioning your name, go ahead and make your way to the House floor down here, and I'll call you when you're up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Henskins and Chairman Cousson. Thank you to the committee for having me here today. I appreciate it. My name is Lori LeBlanc. I am the Executive Director of the Gulf Economic Survival Team, or GEST. GEST is a grassroots advocacy organization that promotes the significance of energy production in the Gulf region to the U.S. economy, small service companies, and middle-class Americans throughout our great nation. I want to say, just for the record, that I do reside in Lafourche Parish, which is the heart of the oil and gas industry for Louisiana and the nation, with having Port Fourchon there. In June of 2010, the Gulf Economic Survival Team organization was born on the bayous of Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes in South Louisiana, amid a fight for their survival of our coastal communities that proudly fuel the rest of our nation. At that time, a presidential moratorium on deepwater drilling in the Gulf of Mexico stopped Louisiana's offshore oil and gas industry in its tracks and threatened the survival of thousands of local businesses that support this vital industry, from boat companies to fabrication shops, from grocery stores to car dealerships. If there is one thing that we learned in 2010, it is what happens offshore matters onshore. And a swift stroke of the president's pen has the power to shut down the offshore industry and decimate the livelihoods of hard-working American men and women along America's Gulf Coast, especially those who live, work, and play on Louisiana's Cajun coast. And here we are, a decade later, our coastal communities and oil and gas industry find themselves in a similar crisis, struggling for survival once again. First, it was an unimaginable pandemic that significantly cut global energy demand, causing massive cuts to production, employment, and tax revenue, and threatening the viability of small businesses along the Gulf Coast. And now the Biden administration has issued 2 federal orders drastically impacting the future of America's offshore energy industry and on the people of our great state of Louisiana. While the 2 Biden orders assert to be a temporary pause for further evaluation of offshore activities, we should all be gravely concerned that more severe, debilitating measures will be implemented throughout the duration of this administration. As you all know in this room, our nation depends on the offshore energy industry, which produces nearly 20% of our nation's energy supply. And with a robust offshore industry comes critically important jobs and livelihoods. Over 11 million jobs are associated with the U.S. energy industry, including nearly 500,000 jobs directly tied to energy production in the Gulf of Mexico. In Louisiana, our offshore workers are the blue-collar workers who proudly do a job producing American energy. From Golden Meadow to Galveston, from La Rose to Lafayette to Lake Charles, we do a job that makes America more independent and more secure for today and for future generations. As you already heard today, I'll just say it again, industry revenues and tax contributions make a significant contribution to state budgets and coastal economies as well. The Gulf of Mexico's offshore oil and gas industry is an economic engine for our nation, contributing $5 to $8 billion per year to the federal treasury and to our coastal communities that depend on energy revenues to fund vital services like education, healthcare, police and fire protection, and highways and infrastructure. Revenues generated by offshore oil and gas production, which you heard earlier by Chairman Chip Klein, projected to be to the tune of $389 million for the next 3 years, to fund critical coastal restoration and levee protection projects that protect our environment. They build our precious wetlands, and they sustain our unique cultural heritage for many generations to come. This has now become about survival of our Cajun culture. And this is our very own, I would like to say, Cajun environmental justice movement to protect and ensure the sustainability of that culture. At a time when Americans should be optimistically looking towards economic recovery, the Biden administration has imposed a moratorium on the offshore lease sales, as well as excessively burdensome permit and plan approval oversight without respectfully consulting with the state of Louisiana or giving careful consideration to the people of Louisiana. Let's be clear, Guest recognizes that climate change is real. We also recognize sea level rise is real, and the threat of both to our coastal communities is real. And we recognize that the state's coastal restoration and protection master plan projects are effectively mitigating the impacts of climate change. And finally, Guest recognizes that the state of Louisiana is working towards meaningful and practical climate change solutions in close coordination with a diverse group of stakeholders, including the energy industry. So today, Guest strongly urges the President to look no further than Louisiana as a leader in balancing America's energy production with a focus on safety and environmental stewardship, while also tackling climate change and implementing large-scale coastal restoration and levee protection projects that ultimately protect our unique Cajun communities. Today, we urge President Biden to build back better by working with us and not against us when it comes to producing American energy while also reducing carbon emissions. We urge the President to come to Louisiana, eat the crawfish in Crowley, the jambalaya in Jeanerette, and the gumbo in Golden Meadow. And then he can see for himself how Louisiana can balance between being an energy state and an environmental treasure. And finally, we urge this committee, the members here today, those that are watching, and all of the stakeholders to go and sign our petition. We did a petition 10 years ago to lift that moratorium, and today we are starting another petition, and I urge you to go to gulfeconomicsurvival.org and sign our petition so we can mobilize our grassroots effort in support for American energy and save Louisiana's communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. LeBlanc, and I'd like to be on that tour with the president. So I appreciate the invitation when we put that together. Up next, we have Mr. Chet Chasson from Port Fourchon. Welcome to the Capitol.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. As you introduced me, I'm Chet Chasson, Executive Director for the Greater Lafourche Port Commission. It would be remiss if I didn't recognize that my Port Commission is the only elected Port Commission for that purpose in the state of Louisiana. I do have members of my commission here, so I'd like to recognize them. They are sitting up there in the gallery. I have Mr. Harris Chucky Sheremy here, Mr. Rodney Gisclair, Mr. Charles Mike Colley, Mr. Curtis Pierce, Mr. Johnny Ardorn. Thank you all for being here.
Members, welcome to the Capitol. Thank you for coming.
All right. Port Fourchon is the premier oil and gas or energy service port in the country, the world, in terms of efficiency. Our tenant companies are a key component in the logistical supply chain for providing the day-to-day services and products needed in exploring and producing oil and natural gas in the Gulf of Mexico. All of the deepwater drilling and production activity in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico is served by Port Fourchon and its tenant companies, and nearly 50% of the shallow water activity. I stand here today representing workers, port workers, and workers statewide because of the existence of Port Fourchon and the tens of thousands more that rely on the port to do their jobs offshore every day to provide the energy needs for our country. More importantly, I stand here representing a heritage, a commission, a community that takes pride in their work. The most recent and anticipated policies impacting the industry are a slap in the face to all of us and undermines the great strides the industry, our state, our community, and Port Fourchon have made over the years. The Greater Lafourche Port Commission operates on a motto of holistic resiliency in everything we do. New infrastructure, port expansion, both past, current, and future, is done with the environment and environmental sustainability in mind. For example, through expansion over the years, the Port Commission has gone above and beyond in creating over 1,000 acres of marsh by beneficially using dredge material. We are in the midst of constructing a coastal wetlands park that will truly highlight how industry and the environment can and do thrive together. None of that work is done in spite of industry, but more importantly, because of industry. We have worked with Shell, Chevron, Danos, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and the Water Institute of the Gulf to create the Partnership for Our Working Coast, in conjunction with the initiatives CPRA and the Master Plan. The partnership objectives is to put the science behind the best location to place future dredge material from the port's channels, to provide the most benefit to the assets of the port and to the community, as well as habitat and the carbon sequestration benefits of the new marshland created or renourished. Again, not in spite of industry, but because of industry. We understand that there is an energy transition afoot, but for the security of our nation, it needs to be smart, calculated, reasonable, realistic, and Port Fourchon is happy to play a role in that. I challenge you to contact members of the Congressional Sportsman Caucus who supported the Great American Outdoors Act of 2020, which the caucus overwhelmingly supported. Tell them that these new policy decisions undermine that act, undermine our energy security, and undermine communities across our country and our great state. Mr. Chairman and members, again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to take any questions if necessary.
Mr. Chasson, there are no questions. We appreciate your time. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Up next to the floor is an old friend of mine who went to college alongside me about 25 years ago, I think, Mr. Paul Danos. Introduce yourself and the company that you're representing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Couson. Thank you, committee, for having me here today. As he said, I am Paul Danos. I'm CEO of Danos. We're an oil and gas service company headquartered in Houma, Louisiana. We have, last time this year we had about 3,000 employees, and we took a punch to the face last year with coronavirus and low oil prices, even negative oil prices, like the whole industry did. But because we have resilient people that work for our company, resilient people that work in our industry, because we're a resilient state, we've been dusting ourselves off, getting up off the mat, and getting back to work, and recovering quite well here towards the end of the year. But then, at the beginning of this year, we take another punch to the face, but this time not from an invisible coronavirus, from politicians in Washington. And so I'm here on behalf of my company, the families that are represented by the people that work for my company, also on behalf of the South Central Industrial Association, the SCIA, which represents the Bayou region. We have 250 member companies, which represent about 200,000 employees. And I'm certainly here on behalf of our community and my family as well. So I think everything I had to say in terms of facts and figures has already been said today, so I'm going to try not to repeat too many of those things. I'll start with the headline, though, that has been said, but it can't be said too many times, and that is this policy, these executive orders that are coming out of Washington are bad for the environment. And I say that because, as the headline, because that is the whole reason that the president and his administration would have us believe that they're putting these executive orders, these moratoriums on leasing in place, is for the sake of the environment. It's bad for the environment. It's been said many times today. We produce oil and gas in the state of Louisiana, in the country of the United States of America, with a lower carbon footprint, lower greenhouse gas emissions than anywhere else in the world. So to constrain supply in the U.S. will only do one thing. If you stayed awake in your econ classes, and as Chairman Couson said, he and I were in class together. We were in internal audit class together, and I never once saw him sleeping in class. So I'm sure that he stayed awake in his econ classes, as did I. If we constrain the supply here in the U.S., that will not impact the demand of oil and gas throughout the world. All that will do is send that oil and gas production to other places who produce oil and gas not as clean, not as safe, not as efficiently as we do here in the U.S. and here in the state of Louisiana. So it's bad policy, it's bad for our environment. And by the way, those countries who will pick up our slack, in general, don't like our country. So for so many reasons, that is the headline. It's bad environmental policy, what we're seeing. In addition, we talk about jobs, we talk about our coast, the money that we have, the funding from royalty sharing, lease sharing, all those things are at risk. But for me, I'll just bring it down to a personal level. Again, we have our company, what we do is provide a service through people. We don't have a lot of assets. We have some, but primarily what we do is we employ really wonderful people, most of whom are from here in the state of Louisiana, some from other states along our Gulf Coast and other areas. But these are great people, hardworking folks. And on Monday, I had the opportunity to be at our fabrication shop down on the Rose, Louisiana, and Congressman Scalise was in town, and he stopped to visit with our folks. And there were some hard questions about what happens if they shut us down. What do we do? There are no good-paying renewable energy jobs around the corner for us. And let it be known that our company, my company, is all in for energy transition in a way that's scientifically sound and paced appropriately for the technology that's out there. We are investing, we are participating with our customers, but we have to do it in a way that makes sense. So these people were asking hard questions, and it just so happens that the guy who runs our fab shop is a guy I went to high school with. His name's Eric. There's two other guys that I went to high school with that are part of his leadership team, Clint and Mike. There's another guy there whose kids go to school with my kids, that's Jerry. So what I did, is I told Eric and Clint and Mike and Jerry that I was going to be fighting for them. I was going to be fighting against bad policies that will steal jobs from these guys that I know, that I grew up with, that I was friends with before they worked for me, and take their jobs and send them overseas to produce oil and gas in another country in a less environmentally friendly way at a higher cost than we're producing it here, that I would fight for them. And that's really what I'm here to ask this committee to continue to do. And I know you are, and you have, and I want to thank you for that. So thank you for fighting with us for the communities of Louisiana, the folks, the people that work for companies like ours that represent the South Central Industrial Association. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for all that you do to advance the interests of the state of Louisiana, our working coast, the safety and security of our nations, and the people of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And Danos is a company that is one of the ones that we've been referring to all day today, homegrown. You mentioned your friends. I think that everybody here from an elected perspective can say that we're all working for them as well, so you can relate that to them. So appreciate you being here and taking the time. Next, I'd like to introduce Ben Marlborough from the Bayou Industrial Group. After Ben will be Mike Monclaw, Lauren Chauvin, Brian Hanks, and Jaden Barrigy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Ben Marlborough. I'm here representing the Bayou Industrial Group. Bayou Industrial Group is an organization of 150 businesses in the Bayou region, mostly Lafourche and Terrebonne, and some members from Assumption and St. Mary. We obviously are proud to call America's working coast our home. We feel that we are very proficient at fueling America, but also understand how doing that we can also work day in and day out in building a healthy and sustainable environment while fueling America. Certainly don't want to belabor any of the points that have been spoken all morning by some incredible speakers and organizations. It certainly can't be stated enough the economic impact that these executive orders will have on the region, as President Chasson, President Dove, Chet, Paul, all the members before have stated. The crippling effect it'll have on the direct jobs, the indirect jobs, the money to fund local governments. But there's something I definitely want to touch on, and it's also been mentioned, something that's near and dear to myself and certainly the region. And that's the Go Mesa side, the restoration and protection side, and how integral it is for our Bayou region and Bayou Industrial Group. My day job is as the director of the Bayou Lafourche Freshwater District. We've been working diligently to implement a project that's essentially going to introduce more fresh water from the Mississippi River into Lower Terrebonne and Lafourche to combat saltwater intrusion, which is that area is seeing some of the largest land loss rates on the globe. That project was introduced and formulated in the late 80s and early 90s. Actually, I was 9 years old when that project was formulated, and the preliminary design of that project was completed in 2006. So 15 years ago, before we had the recurring revenues that Chairman Klein talked about through Go Mesa and even the Coastal Impact Assistance Program, which came before that, the project was stalled. We had no construction dollars. We couldn't get any momentum going. Since then, since 2010, with the influx of these recurring revenues from offshore oil and gas, we've been able to implement and initiate $134 million worth of improvements to that project, and about $95 million of that money comes directly from revenue sharing programs from the Outer Continental Shelf, okay, to the tune of $30 million through CAP and $65 million through Go Mesa. So these are extremely integral funding sources for this state, especially the Bayou region of Terrebonne and Lafourche. As Chairman Klein stated earlier, over the last 4 years, Go Mesa contributions to the state have totaled more than $273 million. And as he stated, these are not necessarily conservation projects They fall more under the auspices of protection projects. These are the projects that allow us and our member companies and residents to live in the Bayou region that ultimately allows us to efficiently produce the energy that fuels America. About $50 million of that Go Mesa every year over the last 4 years has come to the Bayou region. It can't be stated enough that Go Mesa is simply a matter of survival for us in the Bayou region that will allow us to live there. As he stated earlier, Chairman Klein, as Go Mesa funds are depleted, Restore Act money expires in 2032, we're left back to fighting for about $40 million a year statewide to restore and build the coast, which falls under the auspices of a $50 billion master plan. It's not attainable. So on behalf of the Bayou Industrial Group, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all. We certainly are willing to work hand in hand and look forward to the opportunity to continue these efforts to get our people, our businesses, and our residents back to work offshore and producing the fuel that fuels America. So thank you very much.
Appreciate your comments, Ben. And there are no questions. Next up, I'd like to introduce Mike Monclaw on behalf of the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association. Mike, the floor is yours.
Chairman Henskins, Chairman Couson, appreciate you guys organizing this consequential hearing. My name is Mike Monclaw. I'm the president of Louisiana Oil and Gas Association. But as many of you may know, I'm also a third-generation rig contractor here in Louisiana and the owner of 6 oil field service companies that do work along the coast. So any job-killing action spurred by the federal government is alarming and will always be near and dear to my heart. I have lived in 2 cities in my life, Lafayette and Houma. And to see what those 2 cities have gone through over the past 6 years of this downturn has been gut-wrenching. In recent years, an article listed Lafayette and the Houma-Thibodaux areas as having the 3rd and 4th worst economies, respectively, in the United States. These 2 areas of Louisiana represent the lifeblood of the service industry that keeps the Gulf of Mexico going. I cannot imagine what a continued ban will do to these areas. NOIA, the National Ocean Industries Association, did a study that illustrates in 2019, the Gulf of Mexico generated 2.3 million barrels per day, 28.6 billion in GDP, 353 million to Go Mesa, and 345,000 jobs. 94,000 of those jobs were in Louisiana. NOIA estimates that a no leasing ban would eliminate 50,000 Louisiana jobs, and a no permitting ban would eliminate 85,000 jobs. The NOIA study also predicts that a ban on leasing and permitting would decrease Gulf of Mexico production from the current level of 1.9 million barrels a day down to 1.1 million barrels a day by 5 years, and down to 750 million barrels a day by 10 years. This number of lost barrels per day can only be replaced by OPEC imports, enemy countries with the emission standards they do not have the emission standards that we have. And let's not forget the decrease in the amount of Go Mesa funds that Louisiana would receive that goes right to our coastal restoration projects. Restricting or ending U.S. oil production will not address climate change. In fact, restricting U.S. oil production would lead to higher levels of greenhouse gas emissions. The Gulf of Mexico production in particular has lower carbon footprint as other regions in the world, as was mentioned earlier. The current 5-year program and the programmatic environmental impact study was promulgated by the Obama administration. So this Biden administration action is pausing the leasing from an Obama plan, not a Trump plan. It is very early on in Biden's administration, but maybe this move was a knee-jerk reaction of him pandering to his far-left base. That will hopefully be corrected. These actions are demoralizing to an industry that has been through a horrific 6+ years and short-sighted on so many levels with regards to the continued necessity of fossil fuels. These actions are a detriment to our way of life in South Louisiana, and LOGA strongly urges Governor Edwards, our state legislature, Attorney General Landry, and our national delegation to stand in unison behind the oil and gas industry and the 1 out of every 9 Louisianians that work in the oil and gas business. We ask that Louisiana push back on the Biden administration as hard as Texas and the other oil and gas dominant states are doing. I've got a 30-second video that I'd like to show you. It's a commercial that was done. It was very well done. If we can make it happen. It's 30 seconds, and it just illustrates the byproducts that come from oil and gas and the importance that our industry brings to the whole nation and the world. Not playing.
Considered how much your world depends on petroleum-based products?
Thank you very much for having me today.
Mike, thank you. And much like Danos in Homa, the Malclaw name is synonymous with oil and gas, and we appreciate your work with LOGA and your contributions over back home in Lafayette. Next, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring to the table Lauren Chauvin with Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. After Lauren, we'll have Brian Hanks, Dr. Dismukes, if you're here with us. I think we we heard from you earlier. And then Don Caffrey and Simone Malaz.
Right.
Ms. Chauvin, the floor is yours.
My name is Lauren Chauvin, and I am the Director of Energy and Environmental Quality for Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. We represent more than 2,000 Louisiana employers. Lobby is the only association serving as the voice of businesses of all sizes from a statewide multi-industry perspective. We represent the people who produce energy as well as those who transport it and consume it. If you look at our oil and gas members, you will see everybody from large multinational corporations to the small homegrown mom and pop service companies and entrepreneurs. We support energy policies that will promote high-paying jobs in this industry, as well as help our resilient service companies thrive. And we promote the production of all forms of energy. I'm here today to voice our concerns about the detrimental impacts of the Biden administration's recent executive orders on the oil and gas industry, its workers, Louisiana, and the very energy transition the administration claims as its goal. The country will not reach the president's environmental goals by dismantling an entire economy, increasing our reliance on foreign oil, or putting thousands of people out of work. I am not here fighting to hold on to an energy economy of the past. I am here fighting for the future. We are fighting for the proper evolution for energy, done smartly with timely choices that match policy with technological, economic, and environmental priorities for everyone. We're fighting for an energy industry of the 21st century, one that makes conservation, innovation, and corporate citizenships their top priority. This industry, which has provided Louisiana's economic lifeblood for more than a century, now finds itself fighting for its survival against the mandates, bans, political propaganda, and polarizing activism of our critics, who do not understand our industry and seek to put it out of business. Our industry does not require an explanation of the needs of a changing world. We are living it and working towards it every single day. What is at stake is not whether oil and gas will be produced in Louisiana or off the Gulf of Mexico. What is at stake is whether these decision makers in Washington will allow Louisiana to transition fairly with an opportunity to compete and contribute to the energy of the future. Louisiana can't afford to be sacrificed in an attempt to artificially move science faster. A true sustainable energy future is going to require the oil and gas industry and Louisiana's skilled workforce, investment, and knowledge. The oil and gas industry has and will continue to invest in innovative energy solutions that will guarantee safe, reliable, affordable energy for our nation while continuing to produce the energy needed now and in the foreseeable future. If you want to build an electric vehicle, you need our industry. We are providing the energy, product, and the products that are needed to create, power, and deliver everything needed for a sustainable energy future, from batteries to biofuel to manufactured equipment. If you need food, medicine, and life-saving vaccines, you rely on vehicles and equipment powered by our products. This is why our workers are and continue to be designated essential workers throughout this pandemic. The current offshore oil and gas industry and its infrastructure is required to support offshore renewable energy industries. Our ports, roads, highly specialized vehicles, and skilled maritime workers, supply chains, etc., are vital to the support of domestic offshore wind and other offshore renewable energy businesses. The need to leverage existing oil and gas development capabilities is especially prominent, for instance, in the work and expertise needed in geological and geophysical surveying of the subsurfaces for structural installment, as well as the construction itself in an offshore environment. A fair and equitable transition to renewable jobs requires the continued development in the Gulf of Mexico. Take wind energy. The current and near-term future expects there to be 38,000 jobs by 2030. In the interim period, an active offshore energy workforce must be maintained, continuously trained, engaged, and employed in the field if they are going to be in the position to redeploy these offshore jobs to wind energy jobs. But even at its best estimates of 83,000 offshore wind jobs, if they were all filled, that leaves 75% of the current 345,000 direct offshore energy jobs in the United States that would be eliminated. This is not just an equitable transition for oil and gas industry workers and families. Today's hearing is not just about the next 4 years of the Biden presidency. It's about the next 4 generations of Louisiana's future. It's about whether we are going to work hand in hand with the industry that has brought high-paying, high-quality jobs and investment to our state for generations, or are we simply going to shut the door on these job creators? Thousands of Louisianans, your constituents, rely on these companies for their livelihoods. Lobbyists here today to ask you to raise your voice against against actions in Washington that will cripple Louisiana's economy and prevent us from fairly competing for the energy jobs of the future. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Chauvin. There are no questions. Members, bear with us. We have 3 more speakers, and then the committee will come to a conclusion. Next, I'd like to introduce Brian Hanks. Brian is with Beta Land Services and sits on the board for the Lobby Energy Committee. He was also formerly the chairman of Louisiana Oil and Gas Association's board. Mr. Hanks, welcome to the Capitol.
Thank you, Chairman Couson. Thank you, Chairman Hinchkins. As Jean Paul just made the announcement, my name is Brian Hanks, and on June 1st, I will have been in this business for mark my 40th year in oil and gas. I've owned my own company, either by myself or alone, since 1992. Beta's been around since 2003. We've worked in 39 different states across the country. We worked in Alberta, Canada. We've been as big as 465 people with 12 offices across the country, mainly related with the various shale plays going on around here. So with the downturn in the industry, we're down to about 4 offices between Texas and Louisiana, but we continue to seek other opportunities. Belong to no industries, organizations, and also, as Jean Paul said, I'm chairman of the Lobby's Energy Council and also have been chairman of LOGA for 8 years of a 2-year term. Focus for today is to present an opportunity. I know most people have been focusing on another aspect of this. This opportunity for the state of Louisiana may be to be able to capture redirected drilling dollars as people look for a place to drill. To stay positive in an otherwise negative national and state environment. Section 208 of the President's executive order deals with oil and natural gas development on public lands and in offshore waters. For the state of Louisiana, the most drastic effect involves offshore waters, and all the service-related companies and their associated services fall into two categories. Those who have services who can perform both onshore and offshore, and those who cannot, boats, helicopters, and the like. Louisiana has the good news is Louisiana has very little BLM or Fed properties onshore. Those, for the most part, deal with the western states, thus creating the opportunity for exploration on fee lands and individual landowners within the state of Louisiana. Unlike BP's Macondo accident in 2010, which actually created the same immediate response by industry and shifted the concentration of operations onshore, in that instance, companies had the opportunity to look at the millions of acres on federal and BLM lands. This time, that option has been taken off the table. What this does is create other opportunities for our state. We must make sure our state is inviting of industry and does not create obstacles for access. We must create the most business-friendly environment we can, given our situation. We can now discuss the governor's role. Last session, the legislature sent a bill to him for signature. He did veto it. He also sent us in his veto an outline in which we could readdress that legislation to include some suggestions, which, in my opinion, some of the suggestions could actually strengthen that bill. We should readdress that situation in the upcoming session. Now is the time to work with the governor to the degree we can to present a positive image to the industry and the nation. We have to understand that there remain some areas we will not agree upon with the governor, which are well documented, and this is not the forum or the place to discuss those today. My suggestion would be to seek out those areas in which we can find common ground and build upon those. Leave the internal fighting within other states to them while we begin addressing the new normal of whatever that may be and get a jump on industry to find a place for their drilling dollars. Section 209 of the President's executive order is most disturbing. It states that the heads of agencies shall identify for the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and the National Climate Advisor any fossil fuel subsidies provided by the representative agencies, and then take steps to ensure that, to the extent consistent with applicable law, federal funding is not directly subsidizing fossil fuels. The Director of the Office of Management and Budget shall seek, in coordination with the leads of the agencies and the National Climate Advisor, and thereafter, to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies from the budget request for fiscal year 2022. This addresses the federal industry tax treatment of intangible drilling costs and reservoir depletion. If they are removed, smaller producers, which make a majority of the operators in the state of Louisiana, which represent actually over 90% of all wells drilled in the state of Louisiana, their tax benefits for the cash flow will be taken away, and they will no longer be able to exist. This has not happened to the large companies. That's probably why you haven't heard much from the other speakers today. The tax credits are capped, and therefore it does not affect the majors and the larger independents. This would be a huge detriment for the industry across the nation, not just Louisiana. Small producers have used these incentives for years as common practice, just as other industries enjoy some versions of federally supported incentives, specifically to those particular individual industries. If specifically to oil and gas, this would be devastating and the end of the small producer, not only in Louisiana, but across the country. We can also look at the LSU Center for Energy Studies that recently has prepared a paper and suggesting some changes to oil and gas severance taxes. And not to bore you with all the numbers, the bottom line is what I will tell you is I would implore you at this point to stand fast and not do anything with regard to taxes. We need to see exactly what's happening, where we're going. You would definitely not want to tax the Haynesville Shale, which is the only truly productive area in the state of Louisiana, represents over 60 or 70% of the production in the state of Louisiana, and the optics that it would provide to the rest of the nation would not be good. It would be counterintuitive to everything I'm telling you today is providing and presenting an inviting culture, an inviting business environment to come here and put your dollars here and we'll appreciate it. We're not looking, because I can tell you every other state is facing the same thing. We worked, like I said, we worked in 39 states, Pennsylvania. They're looking up taxes, Ohio, Colorado. It's everywhere. So we can be different and be inviting for that opportunity. And what else is unique about Louisiana that can be played upon, and I think we should play about more, South Louisiana is fractured. I know everybody talks about the shale plays across and they can drill those long laterals and everything. Well, because of the subsurface fracturing here, it is much more conducive for our state to invite industry here to drill conventional wells, not the horizontal wells, and get back to the oil. We have some of the best rocks in the world. Any geologist will tell you that. Why not play upon that theme that come here, we'll invite you, you drill your conventional wells. I can tell you I'm getting calls for the first time in a long time, people looking to do conventional wells. That's trending across the country because of the fracking issue. No one knows where that's going to end up, where this administration is going to end up. This is this would be an opportunity to put those dollars to use, still drill wells, and still create opportunity for people. So that's my comments in a nutshell is, hold fast, do not increase any taxes. Let's see where we can go here, but let's stress the positive, work with the governor where we can, but we have opportunities that other states don't have because of our opportunity with the great geological rocks, the highly fractured subsurface where we are prone to and can invite conventional drilling versus where the other states can't, and be just as productive and making investments, make smart investments for people on their behalf. And I want to thank everybody. Appreciate it.
Mr. Hanks, we appreciate your comments, and to your point about our efforts to redo and build on our efforts from last year, we have our next speaker, Dr. David Dismukes from the LSU Center for Energy Studies, an economist that is, I think, a good part of any plan when you bring policy on actually the impact on our economy relative to that policy. So with that, Dr. Dismukes, I'll bring you down, and thank you, Mr. Hanks. Floor is yours.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for having me. I'm going to, since we're kind of running low on time, I'm going to keep my comments today a little bit limited so we can kind of focus on some key areas. Just for the record, my name is David Dismukes. I'm a professor and the executive director for the LSU Center for Energy Studies. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the center, it was created by you all in 1981 to serve as a resource on important topics that are impacting energy, the economy, and the environment here in our state. And I can't think of, outside of the pandemic, a more important issue for our state as this set of executive orders that was issued just a few weeks ago. I want to talk about four particular areas, and I'll be brief about those. One is just the general impacts associated with the suspension of new oil and gas drilling activities that was included in the executive order. Some other provisions that are in the order that may not have gotten a lot of attention, like the social cost of carbon that are included in the order. The Keystone XL pipeline revocation of the permit, as well as what this means, I think, from an economic perspective generally for our state and our attempts to recover from this very tremendous pandemic. With regards to the first topic on the suspension of new drilling activity, I think you heard earlier from Ms. LeBlanc as well as from Mr. Gray. While ostensibly these executive orders are earmarked for new drilling activities, they are going to touch on a wide range of existing drilling and production activities. Anything that has or will require some modification or administrative changes, anything in the normal course of activity could be touched by these changes. They occur for existing activities, not only just new activities. So while there has been some discussion, I think, in the media that has created a certain sense, a false sense of security that these won't have impacts, trust me that they will, and they will have immediate impacts. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that these will have immediate and detrimental impacts on our state from the day that they were announced and they were in the press and continuing into the future. The other thing to keep in mind, which I'm sure some of you appreciate, is that the energy business in this state is in any state, in any part of the world, is a very capital-intensive industry. And capital-intensive industries abhor uncertainty. And the one thing that you can say from the day this executive order was issued is that this creates a chilling effect for capital formation in this industry in our country. And this is a time at which you certainly don't want to be doing things of that nature. In C-suites throughout the United States and throughout the world that have activities here in the Gulf of Mexico, this will have a chilling effect on continued capital formation. And it's not just alone in the upstream exploration and production side of the business, but throughout the entire value chain that will include the midstream part of the business in pipelines and processing, as well as in the downstream refining, and even the petrochemical industry, which has made tens of billions of dollars here in our state to use low-cost, widely available hydrocarbons to turn into a wide variety of chemicals and commodity chemicals and components that you saw from the video that Mr. Monclaw had earlier that touches our daily lives. Modern chemistry touches our daily lives, and modern chemistry is formed out of those hydrocarbons. The last thing I want to talk about, the suspension of this new drilling activity, and while it's ostensibly for a fixed period of time, trust me, this is just the beginning. This is just an initial phase, I think, to what will likely be a longer-run assault on oil and gas activities in the Gulf of Mexico. There are going to be continued regulatory actions that are envisioned by these executive orders that are going to have ongoing negative impacts that are going to get harder and harder to essentially invest money in the Gulf of Mexico and get a rate of return on investments here that are comparable to what you would get in other places around the world. One of those things that I'd like to touch on is this included in this executive order is a requirement for all executive agencies to start considering the social cost of capital in their regulatory decisions. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what the social cost of capital is, it is going in and essentially pricing a wide range of things that could impact human health outcomes, aesthetic outcomes, a wide range of outcomes that occur because of the combustion of hydrocarbons and essentially carbon emissions into the environment. The problem with considering these social costs as opposed to mitigation costs, where you're essentially looking at a cost for carbon capture, utilization, and storage like Mr. Gray talked about, is that there are a wide range of estimates. I have presented charts before various regulatory bodies as well as my own class that shows the estimates of how these social costs are developed. And it's like taking a piece of paper and shooting a shotgun at it. You can have estimates all over the place, and you can really use an estimate to develop any kind of outcome that you want from it. This will create a high degree, I think, of subjectivity in the rulemaking process for every executive agency. And again, this is not going to be limited to just BSEE and BOEM, but will include all Department of Interior types of decisions, BLM. It will include decisions associated with the Corps of Engineering, everything that the FERC, the FERC, in permitting LNG facilities, a wide range of things where we've seen large capital investments in our state will be touched and impacted by these requirements. This will go, and this process is going to start immediately. The executive order requires a temporary use of these values for the first 30 days, and for this ad hoc committee to develop permanent ones that will be used and will go into place through rule promulgation a year later. So again, this is something that is going to have an ongoing impact because it will prejudice the development of fossil fuels as well as a wide range of infrastructure that we're going to need, ironically, to move our clean economy. That may include things like blue and green hydrogen, may facilitate the movement of carbon, and may also facilitate carbon capture and storage as well as renewable energy itself. So this is going to be very problematic on a forward-going basis. The next area I want to talk about is the Keystone Pipeline. As many of you know, Louisiana labor is very mobile. There are a lot of people that work in our industry and work around the country on a variety of different projects. I've already had 2 students of mine tell me that they have family members that are going to be touched by this decision to cancel and revoke the license. A lot of people that are associated that work here and live here and pay taxes here in Louisiana are going to be impacted by that. But I think more importantly is that this is going to change the supply disposition for crude oil in the region, which in turn will impact refinery profitability in the region. And while this pipeline is not directly traversing through the state of Louisiana, it will have an impact on the industry throughout the Gulf of Mexico, and that's going to include our refineries here at home as well. Lastly, and I think equally important, is what this means for the economic recovery. As you can imagine, And I think as Ms. LeBlanc mentioned earlier, the pandemic has been exceptionally brutal to the oil and gas business and to energy in general, as we have changed our commuting patterns, as we've stopped traveling, as people are staying home. This has had tremendous impacts on energy demand. We've seen unprecedented coordination in trying to contain a global crude oil supply between the OPEC Plus members to winnow out the excess supply that is out there. But it is something that has impacted our industry very significantly here. Our overall employment in the upstream side of the business is down by about 22%. So we're in a position right now in our industry where we're already down because of the pandemic. This is just another negative impact that was going to occur and will not help in terms of recovering in that upstream sector. That's not the only area where and keep in mind that where we've been in employment in the upstream part of the business during the rush out of the last recession and the period from 2010 until we got into the price war with OPEC from 2014 to 15, oil prices were in the $100 to $130 a barrel range. Our employment here in Louisiana was between 50 to 52,000 employees. That number after that correction and that price war dropped down to 30. Today we're down to 25,000 workers in that upstream part of the business. That's a lot of ground that we need to make up, and these kinds of decisions that have come out of this executive order are not going to help facilitate our recovery. The same is true in industrial construction. As you know, we've seen tens of billions of dollars, I think in the order of $85 to $95 billion of energy-related projects here in the state. At one time, we were employing as much as 31,500 people in industrial construction activities. Those were down considerably as we slowed down in the end of 2019 going into the pandemic. Today, we are down 17,500 jobs. Again, a very big deterioration in our job situation and a very big hurdle that we need to climb without having these kinds of negative decisions made from Washington. Today, our industrial construction is about 55% of where it was in its peak in early 2018. In the refinery sector, we've also seen employment drop from around 12,000 to 11,300. Again, another significant decrease. And while the chemical industry has been relatively flat at 27,000 jobs, if you look at the projected growth from 2016 to 18 and continue that trajectory, we ought to be at a much higher level than we are right now. So while it looks like we haven't lost any jobs, we're certainly down relative to the prior trajectory that we were at. Last thing I want to say about this is, Ms. LeBlanc talked earlier about the Gulf Economic Survival Team and its origins in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon spill. And if you will think back to where the industry was during that time period, and you think about these decisions, there's a lot of parallels between that moratorium then and what's happening right now. But there are some very, very significant differences that you need to keep in mind. Back then, in 2010, as we started to come out of the recession, while crude prices fell, they accelerated back up to over $100 a barrel. During that time period, most of our oil and gas companies were very, very healthy. They had very healthy balance sheets. They were not overly leveraged. Many of them did not lay off employees and instead redistributed them around the United States, particularly in unconventional developments in the Bakken Shale and in Eagle Ford and in the Permian Basin. Those kinds of conditions do not exist today. The industry is not on a healthy footing because of huge accumulations of debt and going in and developing unconventional resources, and the pandemic and the impacts that it has had on energy demand and a wide range of energy products that we've made over the last several years. There's simply the sustainability of being able to withstand an event like this and decisions like this are much more challenged today than they have been in the past, and I think it's something that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about what this means for our economy and our citizens here. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again and thank the committee members for listening to me. I know you all are pressed for time. I'm happy to answer any questions, but if not, please feel free to use us as a resource in the future and to help out with any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Dismukes, and we will use you as a resource, and you gave us a lot of information in a short amount of time, so if you don't mind, I'll probably get you back to our committee at some point relative to specific bills and, you know, from not just this session, but in years to come. Thank you, sir. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Kevin Hayes to the floor. Kevin is going to speak on behalf of the Louisiana Landowner Association. He has a 45-minute PowerPoint presentation, and no, I'm just joking. Kevin has some comments, and then I'll read some statements, or I'll read the folks who had submitted statements to the committee, and then we'll be on our way. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Kusan, Chairman Henskins, members of the committee. This has been a very informative and thorough committee hearing, and I think it was very much needed. My name is Kevin Hayes. I'm here on behalf of the hundreds of members of our Louisiana Landowners Association, which was established in 1975 to deal with issues exactly like this. I've enjoyed all the comments I've heard today. I really appreciate Chip Klein's comments about the coast and working with coastal landowners. We really do enjoy that partnership. The Louisiana Landowners Association steadfastly opposes President Biden's ban on the leasing and permitting of federal lands and waters for oil and gas development. The negative effects this ban will have on the economy and revenues of the state of Louisiana will be enormous. The marginal climate benefits to be gained by such a ban, if any, and many would argue there are none, are far exceeded by damage it will cause to the state's budget, which heavily relies upon GOMESA revenues, which you've heard today are generated from mineral leasing and royalties on federal lands in the Gulf of Mexico, to support the state's efforts at coastal protection and restoration. In addition, thousands of Louisiana citizens are at risk of losing their livelihoods due to the ban, a result similar to the experience of other states dependent on the recently canceled Keystone Pipeline. The financial impact created by this ban on our fellow citizens, friends, and neighbors will be one of the great catastrophic self-inflicted wounds created by the Biden administration, the adverse results which we felt for many years. Lastly, the LLA is concerned that the loss of oil industry talent will increase costs and reduce exploration and development within Louisiana, further curtailing exploration and development on private and state lands. The federal ban will only hasten the death of an already anemic oil and gas industry in this state. Future oil and gas development, whether on federal, state, or private lands, will be irreparably suppressed, an industry once essential to Louisiana since oil was first discovered in this state in 1901, will for all practical purposes cease to exist. Thank you for the opportunity to express our concerns regarding this terrible and completely misguided federal policy, and we on behalf of the Louisiana Landowners Association look forward with working with you and the committee to define solutions for our great state. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kevin. There are no questions.
Thank you.
We appreciate your comments. And members, I know each of y'all are leaving. I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking it out through the end. And it won't be forgotten. This was a very informative day. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna read the organizations who submitted testimony that will be in the record for the hearing. We received written comments from healthygolf.org, the Consumer Energy Alliance, Restore Retreat, the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, Sierra Club Delta Chapter, LaMoga, Louisiana Chemical Association, and the Louisiana Landowners Association. As I said, with all those comments together, it's several pages. It's impossible for me to read them all, but they will be submitted into the record for posterity. We have a little bit more bookkeeping just for me. Is that correct? Or does anybody else need to stick around for the bookkeeping? No? Members, I am going to entertain a motion from our Senate chairman, who has made a motion to adjourn the Senate committee. Are there any objections? The Senate committee is adjourned. I will entertain a motion to adjourn from Representative Mincy to adjourn for the House committee. Hearing no objections, the House committee is adjourned, and our meeting, our joint meeting, is concluded for the day. Thank you again for your attendance.